Hello, fellow sapiens, and a quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're curled beneath blankets listening through low light, walking the long road home with stars above, or filling the quiet while you drive, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're going in search of why we humans lost our fur, and how that bare skin quietly rewrote our evolutionary path. This is deep time storytelling for the quietly curious. This is the untold story of bare skin, a transformation that began over 2 million years ago, shaped by heat, motion, and silence. But it's not the simple story of nakedness you might expect. It begins not with a fashion or fire, but with the wind, the sun, and a new kind of sweat. And you know, if you're one of those strange and thoughtful humans who appreciates slow, science-based storytelling, just look below the video. The button that says subscribe is right there. You can tap or press it, unsubscribe any time, and if you tap the little bell beside it, you'll get a note when new episodes arrive. That small click helps this channel survive. Without subscriber support, we simply can't keep making videos like this. Oh, and where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, tell us in the comments. A quiet reminder that we are all listening together, and if sleep arrives, let it. Timestamps are below when you return. Now we begin with the heat beneath our skin. Why did humans lose their fur? It is a question as old as curiosity itself, a mystery that clings not to the surface of our skin, but to the strange silence where once there was a coat, a cover, a veil of warmth and anonymity. We stand apart from our closest relatives not only in what we do or how we think, but in the most basic fact of our biology. We are naked apes, mostly hairless, almost absurdly so. And yet, this vulnerability, this exposure, is not a flaw. It is a signal, a relic, a clue. Tonight we begin with the absence, with the question etched into the very shape of our bodies. Why are we bare when every other great ape remains cloaked in fur? The chimpanzee, the gorilla, the orangutan, they move through their worlds with thick layers of hair, adapting to heat, cold, and rain with natural insulation. Even the bonobo, so close to us in DNA and demeanor, wears a soft coat of black. Among the primates, we are the anomaly, the outlier. Our skin breathes the open air, visible and unshielded, even in childhood, even in old age. If evolution favors the traits that help a species survive, then how could such nakedness have been selected at all? To understand the full weight of that question, we must first step back, not just into the past few centuries of theory and folklore, but into the deeper, stranger history of how we've tried to make sense of our own exposure. Because long before Darwin, before gene sequencing and comparative anatomy, there were older stories. Myths whispered around fires, allegories carved into sacred texts. Some said we lost our fur in punishment, cast out of paradise, and left bare before the world. Others said it was the price of knowing that once we learned shame, we covered ourselves, no longer needing nature's covering. In these tales, nakedness became a moral condition, a symbol of fall and fracture. But what if it was not shame that made us shed our fur, but something else entirely? The oldest stories often use metaphor to point towards something real, not literal truth, but symbolic resonance. Shame, perhaps, was our ancestors' way of articulating discomfort, not just social, but physical, a sensitivity to being seen. But stripped of parable and poetry, the question remains, what forces were at work, grinding over eons, that made fur a disadvantage and bare skin a necessity? Because losing fur was not a small change. Fur is armour, fur is warmth, fur is protection against insects, UV radiation, and the rawness of the elements. To give it up must have been a transaction, a trade. So what did we gain in return? What happens when the body chooses openness over defence, when survival is rewritten not by what covers the skin, but by what happens beneath it? To begin answering that, we must first look closely at the world that shaped us, the African plains of deep prehistory, where air shimmered with heat and dust. There, the early members of our genus walked upright beneath a merciless sun. Imagine it, open savanna stretching toward a trembling horizon where trees gave way to grasslands and shade was scarce. The air thick with the hum of insects, the distant tremor of hooves, the shimmer of mirage. In such a world, fur became a burden. Each strand trapped heat against the body, stifling the flow of air, slowing the cooling of blood, and the sun, unrelenting, punished those who could not shed it. It was here that nature began its long negotiation. Heat demanded adaptation. Movement required efficiency, and over hundreds of thousands of years something radical unfolded. A trade between protection and performance. The fur receded, not all at once, but patch by patch, generation by generation, until the skin itself became a new kind of frontier. What had once been covered was now exposed to light and wind. What had once repelled the world now interacted with it directly. But this loss of fur was not only a biological shift, it was an existential one. Because for every adaptation that benefits survival, there is an echo in the psyche, a reflection in the mirror of consciousness. To be bare is to be seen. To lose one's covering is to feel the world more intimately, its cold, its heat, its touch, its gaze. And perhaps that awareness began before language, in sensations alone. The feeling of sun on the back, the sting of a thorn against open skin, the brush of another's hand, awareness born from contact. When later cultures told stories of shame and exposure, they were not entirely wrong. They were remembering something older than sin, the primal recognition that to be uncovered is to be vulnerable, and that vulnerability is a form of knowledge. The myths, in their own way, encoded memory. A time when our ancestors were no longer sheltered by fur, when every movement through grass and shadow was felt more directly. Nakedness, then, was not moral, but sensory, an awakening to the body's dialogue with the earth. And still, the mystery deepens, because evolution rarely removes without reason. It is frugal, deliberate. Every loss conceals a gain. Beneath the vanishing fur, the skin began to change, thickening, darkening, sweating. It became active, dynamic, alive with glands that could cool the blood and regulate heat through rivers of salt water. The price of openness was vulnerability. The reward was endurance. The body, once hidden beneath fur, became a living instrument for survival in motion. So the question shifts again. Was our nakedness a weakness, or a beginning? To call it a beginning is to recognize that evolution does not create in straight lines. It carves in spirals, loops and reversals, shaping life not through perfection but through compromise. The disappearance of fur, for example, was not simply a loss of warmth. It was an opening of possibility. With bare skin, the body became a new kind of landscape, one that could sweat, flush, and radiate heat faster than any mammal of its size. This was not just adaptation, it was transformation. While furred animals panted to cool their blood, our ancestors used the vast surface of their skin as an engine of endurance. Through pores and salt, they learned to run farther, chase longer, survive under the cruelest heat. Nakedness became power disguised as fragility. But with power came exposure. Every advantage in nature carries its shadow. Without fur, the body invited danger. Ultraviolet radiation, parasites, and the sharp edge of temperature swings between day and night. It also invited the attention of others. Bare skin reflected light differently. It carried scent, displayed wounds, and revealed health. It could blush. It could communicate without sound. The skin became language before there was language, a living script of emotion and survival. What must it have felt like, then, to live inside such a body for the first time? To feel the wind not through fur but directly on the flesh, to sense the burning of midday, the cool of dusk, the sting of rain. Every moment became an encounter, every sensation a negotiation with the elements. The body was not simply adapting to the world, it was learning to become the world, porous, open, reactive. And through that constant exchange, a new kind of consciousness might have begun to stir, an awareness not only of what the body endured but of the body itself. Across millennia that awareness grew, refracted through story and symbol. Ancient peoples, long after fur had vanished from their lineage, still remembered the strangeness of exposure. They wrapped themselves in skins, in woven fibres, in ritual paint, not to hide what was shameful, but to recreate what had once been natural. To cover was to imitate the past, to wear memory as protection. But beneath each layer the truth remained. The human form was a creature of light and heat, a body sculpted by endurance and openness. And so, our question deepens still further. For in gaining this new physiology, we also gained a paradox, the constant need to shield what evolution had uncovered. To lose fur was to step into the elements. To survive that step, we learned technology, cooperation, and imagination. The skin, once simply the edge of the self, became the meeting point between nature and culture, between what we are born with and what we make to survive. It was here that humanity began to define itself, because from the moment the skin was laid bare, every step into the world became a conversation, a dialogue between climate and body, between biology and choice. Other species adapted passively, fur thickened, pores hardened, instincts deepened. But humans did something different. We recognized our exposure and responded not just with flesh, but with foresight. We shaped tools, wove garments, built fire, not to replace fur, but to transcend it. The absence on our bodies was an invitation to innovation. And perhaps that is the deeper truth, that what we lost in insulation, we gained in imagination. Still, the evolutionary ledger was not simple. For every solution, a new problem emerged. Without fur, we were colder at night, more prone to injury, more reliant on group survival. The lone human, stripped of covering and tools, was vulnerable in almost every biome on Earth. But together we compensated. Together we built shelters. We passed knowledge. We made meaning. Skin became not just barrier but symbol, a shared surface between selves. And perhaps this is why, across cultures, the human form remains both sacred and contested. To be naked is to be unarmed, but also unhidden. It is to stand in truth. And yet, nature does not measure truth in moral terms. It selects only what endures, what reproduces, what passes on. So the question remains, how did a hairless body become a successful one? How did this evolutionary gamble, this turning away from fur, result not in extinction, but in expansion? Part of the answer lies not in what was lost, but in what was gained within. As the skin was exposed, the underlying systems of thermoregulation adapted rapidly. Eccrine sweat glands multiplied, flooding the body with a cooling system more efficient than any found elsewhere in the animal kingdom. Blood vessels beneath the surface became highways for heat dispersal. The brain, always hungry for stability, found a partner in this new skin, a silent regulator, a living thermostat. While other mammals rested in shade, early humans could run, and run, and run. Not with speed, but with stamina, not with claws, but with strategy. We became persistence hunters, capable of tracking prey for hours, even days, until it collapsed from heat exhaustion. It was not strength that made us apex predators, it was endurance, and that endurance was born in part from nakedness. But no adaptation is pure. What made us efficient also made us dependent, on water, on salt, on cooperation. The skin could cool us, yes, but only if we could sweat, and sweat only mattered if we could replace what was lost. This fragile balance tied us to sources of water, to patterns of migration, to shared effort. In the quiet arithmetic of survival, our bareness made us social, it made us storytellers, it made us human. So then, perhaps the naked body is not just a fact, but a clue to who we were always becoming, and in that clue lies a mirror, one not made of glass, but of flesh, of skin that glows with health, with fear, with desire, with time. Unlike fur, which conceals and homogenizes, our bare skin reveals difference. Age, stress, illness, attraction, all made visible through subtle shifts in hue, in moisture, in muscle tone. We read each other without words. We blush, we pale, we flush with warmth. The body speaks long before the tongue. Nakedness, then, became an accidental language, a visual chorus of signals passed between kin and stranger alike. This visibility, for all its risks, gave rise to something new, intimacy. To touch the skin of another is not merely contact, it is communication, it is trust. Through skin, infants find security. Through skin, lovers find one another. Through skin, the dying are comforted. Beneath the evolutionary pressures that sculpted thermoregulation and locomotion, another force was working in silence, connection. Bare skin made us more readable, more sensitive, more dependent on the presence and care of others. It made us transparent, and in that transparency, profoundly social. And still, we return to covering. To cloth, to ritual. Not because we forgot our evolutionary gains, but because we remembered what was lost. Fur, once unconscious protection, became a memory woven into garments. We reimagined it in hide fibre, in woven thread, in warmth held close. The act of clothing became more than utility, it became meaning. What we wore said something of where we were, what we valued, whom we belonged to, and under it all the skin waited, listening. To trace this journey is to recognise the paradox at the heart of our species, that in exposing ourselves to the world, we became better at surviving it, that in surrendering a layer of defence, we opened ourselves to layers of complexity, social, biological, emotional. The naked human was never just a creature of heat, it was a creature of nuance. And so the question beneath the skin still lingers. Why did humans lose their fur? We can trace the science. We can follow the clues in sweat glands, in DNA, in heat maps and fossilized footprints. We can even speculate across myth and metaphor. But perhaps the truest answer is not a single cause, but a chorus of needs. To move, to cool, to see and be seen, to touch and be touched, to adapt not only in body but in mind. Because in the end, the loss of fur was not a flaw to be corrected. It was a canvas to be filled, a stage on which everything human could unfold. Motion, invention, vulnerability, desire. The skin was never empty. It was always waiting for light, but the light that met it was not always gentle. It was the hard light of the African plains, unfiltered by leaves or canopy, spilling across wide expanses where forest once stood and now only dry wind moved. 2 to 3 million years ago, the world began to tilt in quiet rebellion. Global climates shifted their rhythms, rain cycles broke. The great lush forests that once blanketed Central and East Africa began to thin, fracture, retreat. What was once green and shadowed grew brittle, golden, sparse. And in that broken edge between forest and open land, something began to stir on 2 legs. The earth was not at war, but it was in motion, tectonic, atmospheric, cyclical motion that knew no mercy and offered no explanation. East Africa's Rift Valley deepened, pulling the land into jagged corridors of dust and stone. The monsoons weakened, the air grew dry. Forests that had stood for millions of years began to vanish within a geological heartbeat. The ancestors of apes, once perfectly adapted to life in the trees, were confronted with a vanishing home, and so necessity gave birth to experiment. Some clung to the canopy, their hands still curled around branches that led upward, but others stepped out into the clearing, into a world with fewer trees and more space, fewer shadows and more sky. They moved cautiously, hesitantly, with knees that bent and backs that straightened. Each step not just a motion but a question. Can we survive out here? It is difficult to imagine what that first moment of exposure felt like, to rise in the heat of the sun without the veil of leaves above, to look across a plain and see no shelter, no height, no concealment, to be small beneath a sky that seemed impossibly vast. But this was the crucible in which human evolution would be forged, not in safety, but in exposure, not in the abundance of forest fruit, but in the gamble of open space. As the trees vanished, so did the vertical certainty of ape life. Branches once held the body, now the ground would have to, and so, over tens of thousands of generations, a new shape began to emerge. Hips that widened, spines that curved, feet that flattened and lengthened. The body reoriented itself to the horizon. The gaze moved forward. The arms, once used for swinging, were freed for holding, for building, for later, for carrying stories. But none of this was guaranteed. The open land was not a gift, it was a trial. Because what is a forest if not a sanctuary? A place of cover, of layered escape, of upward options. The savannah offered none of that. It was heat, wind, thorns, and predators. It was light without mercy. It was a question with no answer yet, only movement, only change. And the body, that soft and ancient archive of struggle, began to change with it. Standing upright was not a sudden revelation. It was a slow wager, a recalibration written in bone and balance. To walk on 2 legs is to defy gravity in a new way. It is to shift the burden of motion from the shoulders to the hips, to trade the agility of the trees for the endurance of the earth. But why would such a dramatic change take root? What force was so unyielding that it rewrote the entire geometry of the primate form? The answer is written in heat. In the open savanna, the sun does not strike equally. For a quadruped, the back becomes a wide, flat surface, exposed to the sun's vertical wrath. But when a creature stands tall, narrowing its profile, it catches less sunlight on the hottest part of the day. The body becomes a column, not a canvas. Less heat absorbed, more time to move, more time to search, to forage, to follow the herds. This was not just about posture, it was a thermodynamic strategy. Bipedalism became a form of cooling, and with cooling came conservation. Standing tall freed the arms for use, yes, but it also changed the way we spent energy. Walking on two legs, while mechanically complex, is surprisingly efficient over long distances. The pendulum-like swing of the limbs, the elastic recoil of tendons, the careful storage and release of kinetic force, all of it reduced the metabolic cost of motion. The early hominins unknowingly became marathoners, not of speed, but of persistence. But every adaptation is paid for in kind. The upright body is more exposed, it is slower to sprint, it is less stable on rough terrain, it sacrifices power for efficiency. A human form cannot leap through branches or hide in canopy. It cannot rely on fur to shade or shield. And so the body made further bargains. The sweat glands multiplied, the skin darkened, the legs lengthened, the Achilles tendon thickened into a taut spring. The head shifted atop the spine, and the eyes locked onto the horizon, scanning, always scanning. To walk upright is not only to move differently, it is to see differently, to anticipate, to imagine what might lie beyond the ridge, over the next plain. The act of walking became a ritual of forward thought, a commitment to places not yet reached, to water not yet found, to danger not yet encountered. And in that act a mind began to mirror the motion. The brain grew not just larger but more curious. But what must it have felt like for those early walkers to be so small against so much sky? To know that there were no vines above, no trees to climb if danger came, to feel the wind press against bare skin, the earth heat beneath the feet, the slow ache of unending travel. And yet, they kept walking, not just towards survival, but towards something else, something just beginning to wake beneath the surface of the bones. But the path was never safe. The savannah was not empty. It pulsed with eyes and hunger. Lions prowled the tall grass with silence honed over eons. Leopards crouched in shadows that barely held form. Hyenas waited, watching, calculating. Crocodiles slid beneath the surface of shrinking rivers. And the early hominins, smaller than you might imagine, slow by the standards of prey, soft-skinned and underarmed, walked into this arena with little more than sight and strategy. To be exposed is to be vulnerable, and on the savannah there was nowhere to hide. No high branches to scramble into, no thick foliage to mask a scent, no fur to blend into the golden grasses. Danger was not something to be avoided. It was something to be endured. To be out in the open meant learning new patterns of movement, new timings of rest and vigilance. The shade was precious. The dusk was dangerous. The night, unthinkable. And yet, exposure was not only physical, it was perceptual. The openness changed the way they saw and were seen. In the forest, sound is muffled, vision is fragmented, motion concealed by layers of leaf and branch. But on the plain, the senses had to stretch. Eyes needed distance, ears needed direction. Every rustle mattered. Every silhouette could mean death. The early hominin brain in response became a stage of heightened awareness, a theatre of patterns, threat recognition, and slowly prediction. And the sun. Always the sun. It was not just a source of heat. It was a tyrant, an unblinking force that marked the tempo of movement, dictated the rhythm of shade and search. To walk under its gaze required more than endurance. It required adaptation. The fur, once essential, became a trap, holding heat like a blanket pressed to the skin. Nakedness, for all its costs, became an advantage. It allowed the body to become a radiator, to sweat, to cool, to keep walking when others stopped. But sweat alone was not enough. Without water, it meant death. And so the landscape carved a map of memory. Places where water lingered longest. Places where fruit still clung to withering trees. places where death came quickly. The hominin mind began to hold these memories, to pass them down not in words, not yet, but in movement, in the direction of travel, in the echo of footpaths. Culture, in its earliest seed form, may have been nothing more than a pattern of knowing where to go. What must it have meant to carry all of this in a body so exposed? What thoughts stirred beneath a brow furrowed not by language, but by heat, by hunger, by the shadow of circling vultures? And what stories began to form, not yet spoken, but lived, about the land, the sun, and the fragile upright beings moving across it? Because to be constantly watched, by predators, by the open sky, by each other, is to live inside the architecture of attention, and attention slowly began to shape behaviour. Where once a solitary primate might forage alone in a fruiting tree, now exposure demanded togetherness. To see danger early, to shout a warning, to flank the vulnerable, to pass knowledge of a safe path. These were no longer optional, they were survival itself. The open land punished the solitary, but it rewarded the social. And so they gathered. Not in vast numbers, but in clusters, bands, loose affiliations of kin, of proximity, of trust forged by necessity. The naked body, more visible than ever, became a source of shared awareness. Movements could be seen at a distance. Gestures began to hold meaning. Posture, rhythm, glance. These became primitive language. Before words, there was presence. Before speech, there was coordination, and beneath that a shared rhythm of vigilance. The skin, bare and vulnerable, became a beacon for emotion and health. Sun-darkened, scar-lined, glistening with sweat, it told the story of every hour lived. A body overheating could be seen before it collapsed. A wound could be noticed and tended. A child's fever could be felt in the palm of a hand. This visibility, born from nakedness, deepened the social bond. The group became a sensor, a distributed awareness. The body, now stripped of fur, gave back not isolation but intimacy. Yet even intimacy was shadowed by cost. The insects came in waves. Tsetse flies, mosquitoes, biting midges, drawn to exposed flesh like iron to magnet. They brought blood loss, disease, fever, and with each bite a quiet pressure to evolve or perish. Melanin, dark pigment, became armour of another kind. It shielded the skin from ultraviolet damage, yes, but also seemed to offer some resistance to the ravages of tropical pathogens. Dark skin became the balance point between survival and exposure, a living testament to adaptation in motion, and still the predators stalked the edges of dusk. To live under constant threat did not breed paranoia, it bred ritual. Fires were kept, not for cooking alone, but for light, for protection. Night became communal, sleep became strategic. Sentinels watched as others rested. Children were cradled close. The perimeter was imagined and kept, not with walls, but with presence. Memory became a defence. The places where someone was taken, the routes to avoid, the bend in the trail where lions passed too often. And so knowledge grew, not as abstraction, but as inheritance of pattern. What kind of consciousness forms in such a place? Where death is near, but so is connection. Where the sky is vast, but the circle of firelight is warm. What does it mean to become human, in full view of the wind, the sun, and the ever-watching eyes of the world? Perhaps it means this, to be shaped by that watching, to become aware not only of the world's gaze, but of one's place within it. The savannah did not simply test the hominin body, it etched itself into the mind. It introduced scarcity, it demanded endurance, it sculpted the senses and set fire to curiosity. And from that long exposure, from those days of aching light and trembling shadow, arose something beyond instinct, the beginnings of reflection, because awareness changes everything. The moment a creature not only moves through the world but begins to question its direction, that moment is a fault line in time, and on that open ground, that ancient burning earth, something crossed it, slowly, clumsily, but irrevocably. The body was adapting, yes, but so was the brain. The prefrontal cortex swelling, neural networks branching, memory extending backward, prediction reaching forward. To walk through the savannah was not just to react, but to remember, to imagine, to anticipate. And with that came imagination, the ghost of meaning taking root in practical minds. Even now, the fossil record offers us whispers, femurs tilted for upright gait, knee joints compressed by long travel, footprints hardened in ancient ash at Laetoli. Two pairs, perhaps a child and an adult, walking side by side in soft volcanic dust nearly 4 million years ago. They do not walk fast, they do not run, their stride is measured, deliberate. There is something about them that lingers, not because of how far they walked, but because of why. What were they walking toward? In the savannah there were no guarantees. Every day, every step, every encounter was a threshold between life and disappearance. But the ones who endured, they passed on more than genes. They passed on habits, gestures, preferences. They passed on memory, buried in muscle and mimicry. And those echoes became culture, long before it had a name. We often imagine culture as something written, something sculpted, something built. But maybe it began in firelight glances, in the pressure of a palm on a fevered brow. In the silent agreement to watch the night together, these were the seeds, not of civilization, but of something older, the recognition of others as self, the understanding that exposure could be survived if shared. And so, under that searing sun and circling wind, the naked ape did not merely adapt to a new world, it became a new world. It carried the savannah inside itself, in sweat, in stride, in silence. Its body remembered the heat, its skin remembered the light, and even now, though we hide beneath roofs and wrap ourselves in fabric, something inside us still listens to that echo. The vastness, the danger, the possibility. Because long ago, in the shadow of retreating trees, we did not just step into the open, we stepped into ourselves. And once we did, the rules began to change. The forest had demanded balance, grip, vertical motion, but the plains demanded endurance. They did not reward the fastest or the strongest. They rewarded the ones who could last the longest, who could keep moving under a sun that did not yield. And in this new arena, the struggle was not always against predator or prey. The struggle was against heat, against the invisible fire that builds slowly in the body and, if left unchecked, can collapse even the most capable creature. So the body, always listening, always adjusting, found a new way to survive. Not with teeth or claws, but with salt and water. It began to sweat. It's a quiet miracle, isn't it? To imagine that survival came not through force, but through the gentle, steady release of moisture. A shimmering film drawn from blood and pushed to the surface, evaporating just quickly enough to cool the system beneath. No drama, no display, just the whisper of endurance written across the skin. And yet, sweating is no small feat. To sweat is to lose, to bleed water, to surrender salt. It's expensive. It costs the body vital resources, even as it saves the deeper core from overheating. But the evolutionary bet was worth it. For early humans, the ability to shed heat became a key to unlocking a different kind of hunting, one that didn't require speed but resilience. The body no longer needed fur. Fur trapped heat, kept it close. Sweat, by contrast, cast it away. What mattered now was not insulation, but release. That shift, from retention to radiance, was one of evolution's most profound trades. The human body became less like a shelter, and more like a furnace designed to cool itself from within. And the skin, newly bare, became the stage where that trade played out every hour of the day. Tiny glands beneath the surface turned the body into an engine of evaporation, and with every drop that left the skin, the blood ran a little cooler, the mind a little clearer, the legs a little stronger. But how many creatures can run while sweating? How many can move for hours without stopping to pant, to shade, to rest in shadow? Very few. Most mammals, when they overheat, must pause. They pant, forcing air across moist surfaces in the mouth and throat, trying to pull heat out through respiration. But humans, we became breathers and sweaters. We could inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, and let the skin do its own quiet work beneath the sun. What kind of creature does that make us? To cool ourselves like rivers, not beasts? What must it have cost in blood and thirst to gain this power of invisible endurance? The answer lies in the body's most fragile arithmetic, the equation of heat and loss. For every drop of sweat that saved the brain from boiling, Another drop carried away salt, minerals, hydration. Each step across the plains became an act of quiet defiance against dehydration. The early hominins walked a razor's edge between survival and collapse, and yet the evolutionary experiment persisted, generation after generation, because those who could manage the balance lived long enough to pass it on. To live in heat is to understand it not as an enemy, but as a constant companion. The sun was relentless, but not malicious. It was a sculptor. It carved our biology like wind over stone. The body learned its rhythms, when to move, when to rest, when to conserve. The heart became a metronome for endurance. The blood vessels widened, pulsing closer to the surface, radiating heat through the skin. The brain, so dependent on temperature control, was kept cool by a lattice of veins that threaded across the skull like a map of adaptation. We were not built for comfort. We were built for persistence, and fur, once a friend, became a prison. In the forest it had been shield and softness, a layer of warmth and concealment. But on the savannah fur held the enemy close, heat trapped beneath its fibres, sweat unable to escape, the body suffocating in its own effort. The creatures that kept it had to stop often, pant heavily, retreat to shade. The ones that lost it could stay in motion. Imagine the hunt that followed, not a sprint but a pursuit stretched over hours, perhaps days. A gazelle or antelope built for speed, bolts in a blur of motion, its muscles burning. The human figure follows, slow, steady, tireless. The sun rises higher, the air thickens, the animal must rest, must pant, must cool itself. The human does not. Step after step, breath after breath, sweat evaporating, heat dispersing, heart steady. The distance closes. The prey begins to falter. The hunter's shadow grows longer, patient, inevitable. This was persistence hunting, the art of exhaustion. It did not rely on claws or fangs, but on thermoregulation, on sweat. And so, the very thing that once seemed like vulnerability, bare skin, exposed flesh, the absence of fur, became the foundation of mastery. It allowed early humans to hunt under a sun that stopped every other predator, to become, in time, the only animal that could turn the heat itself into an ally. But like all power, it carried a price. To live this way meant dependence, on water, on cooperation, on memory. The sweat that saved you could also end you if you wandered too far, or forgot where the stream lay hidden beneath the stones. Survival became a conversation with the horizon, one heartbeat, one breath, one drop of salt at a time. And at the centre of this conversation was the body's hidden machinery, the silent orchestra of vessels, fluids and tissues that managed the razor's edge between life and collapse. Skin, now exposed and darkened by the selective fire of ultraviolet light, became more than a surface. It became an interface. A living boundary between the inner furnace and the world's relentless blaze. Beneath it ran the highways of blood, pulsing, branching, converging. Arteries carried warm blood outward, while veins returned it, cooled by evaporation. The skin flushed red when heat built up, signalling the body's attempt to shed warmth. Sweat trickled to the surface, forming thin films that caught the breeze, evaporated, and took the fire with them. The process was not dramatic. There was no roar or burst, only the quiet hiss of balance maintained by chemistry, by rhythm, by the thin veil of salt water drawn across the skin. Salt, that ancient mineral, became both blessing and threat. It allowed the sweat to pull more heat from the blood, made the water more efficient in its task, but it was precious. Lost too quickly, it could bring weakness, confusion, death. And so the balance was sacred. Not too much, not too little, just enough to cool, to cleanse, to survive. This was not brute survival, it was precision, and it made the body into a radiator, not of metal or steam, but of flesh, water, salt, and wind. The human form, upright and lean, became an instrument for heat exchange. Long limbs increased surface area. Sparse body hair allowed evaporation without interruption. The skin itself thickened in places, calloused where needed, yet always breathing, always alive to the touch of the air. The bones beneath began to change shape in response to this system. Broad pelvises for balance, narrow waists for efficient movement, skulls reshaped to manage the heat of an expanding brain, an organ so vulnerable to warmth it could be destroyed by a few degrees too many. Even the nose may have changed. From flat to projecting, a structure that could moisten dry air, cool inhaled breath, prepare it for delicate lungs beneath. The body, head to toe, became a sculpture of thermoregulation, every detail shaped by the need to shed fire while keeping the core alive. But what must it have felt like to live inside that system, to be so finely tuned to danger, to heat, to the taste of salt drying on the lips, to walk not with the certainty of safety, but with the knowledge that every step demanded water, every pursuit risked collapse, and still they walked, across grass that shimmered with light, under skies that offered no shadow. Because to stop was death. To move, and to cool while moving, was the only path forward. But motion alone was never enough. The gift of sweating. The brilliance of the body's radiator came with an invisible tether, the need for water. Every step taken across the savannah was a wager against dehydration. For every bead of sweat that left the skin in the name of cooling, a debt was owed. And that debt had to be paid with rivers, with streams, with knowledge of places where the land opened its veins to the sky. And so, the early humans did not wander blindly. They mapped their world in ways the earth could not record. They remembered where the stones grew slick with moisture, where the leaves drooped heavy with dew. They marked the silhouettes of trees that shaded waterholes, the paths carved by animals who also thirsted. These were not just environmental cues, they were cultural inheritance. The need for hydration birthed the need for orientation. The map of the land was folded into the mind, passed between generations in gesture, in timing, in routes remembered by feet and firelight. Thermoregulation had reached beyond biology. It had become behavioral, and behavior became strategy. The heat did not permit solitude. One body could cool itself, but many bodies together could protect one another, share the burden of carrying water, take turns watching during rest. The sweat that evaporated from one brow could warn others that heat was rising. Skin flushed red became a signal to slow the pace. A stumble under the sun became a call for help. Vulnerability bred cooperation, not weakness. And through that cooperation, survival became more likely. Even tools began to reflect this need. The earliest containers, hollowed gourds, animal bladders, woven fibres sealed with resin, were likely not for food first, but for liquid, for transport of what the body could not live long without. Fire, too, played its part, not only for warmth at night, but for boiling water, making it safe, stretching its use. The body could sweat alone, but to live with that gift demanded a village of skills, and still, the predator's eyes watched from the edge of scrub and tall grass. Because weakness shows through dehydration long before collapse, a faltering step, a lowered gaze, the absence of sweat when it should flow. The savannah taught through death, but also through attention, and so the group learned not just to move, but to monitor. They became caretakers of one another's heat. The regulation of temperature was no longer individual, it had become shared. Evolution, without knowing it, was weaving empathy into flesh. What kind of species emerges from such a crucible? One that sweats like rivers, walks like wind, and remembers like water. One whose survival depends not just on lungs and legs, but on the capacity to care, to recognize danger in another's skin before it's too late. What happens to a mind shaped by sun, salt, and the needs of others? It becomes a mind that understands balance, not just within itself, but between itself and the world. A mind that learns the cost of movement, the weight of heat, the meaning of thirst. A mind that begins to plan, to predict, to provide. In the furnace of the open plains, under skies that punished carelessness, the human brain expanded not just in volume, but in vision. It began to imagine the future, to measure time by sun angles and seasons, to trace the echo of dry riverbeds and know they would flood again someday. The thermoregulation trade was never just a bodily transformation. It was a rewriting of the relationship between the organism and the environment, a pact with the sun that would shape every chapter of human life thereafter. Naked skin meant clarity, sweating meant survival. But those gifts demanded discipline. Water had to be found, preserved, shared. Energy had to be spent wisely, motion had to be measured. These were not only physiological processes, they were the roots of ethics, of planning, of culture. And when the human body became a radiator, it also became a message. In sweat, there was vulnerability. In flushed skin, emotion. In overheating, mortality. The body now revealed its state to others, not just through words, which would come later, but through the evidence of need. The self became legible, and in that legibility compassion could form. A companion saw your trembling hands, a child felt the heat in your touch, a group learned to slow for the sake of the weak. Empathy may not have begun with love, it may have begun with sweat. And still, we evolved farther. We moved out of Africa into colder climates, and learned to clothe our radiators. We built shade where there was none. We stored water, dug wells, devised rituals of hydration and rest. But deep beneath the layers of our inventions, the trade remains. The sweat still beads on our skin under pressure. The salt still stains our collars. The thirst still whispers at the edges of our focus. We are not far from that sunlit plain. We are still its children. What is the body, then, if not a record of its bargains? What is the skin, if not a page where the climate signed its signature? The loss of fur, the rise of sweat, the blossoming of vessels and glands and cooling currents beneath the surface. None of it came without cost. But the reward was extraordinary. The human became a species that could chase, endure, adapt, survive, and in time, imagine. And so we carry the savannah within us, every heartbeat, every drop of sweat, every step taken beneath a burning sky. The body still remembers the trade it made, brutal and brilliant in the silence of the heat. And somewhere, beneath our clothes, beneath our thoughts, it is still honouring that contract, still radiating, still enduring, still human. We lost our fur, but we did not become blank, because skin, exposed to the sky, is never neutral. It is alive, reactive, always listening to light, and in the absence of a pelt it became our signal and our shield, the visible edge of our biology, and a battlefield on which the sun and blood would negotiate the terms of survival. So what does skin do when it is laid bare to the equator? It becomes intelligent. Not in the way of thoughts or speech, but in chemical language, in cells that can taste photons, in pigments that are summoned like soldiers to the front lines. Deep in the embryonic folds of the skin, specialized cells, melanocytes, begin to rise. Like painters climbing to scaffolds, they take their position near the basal layer of the epidermis. Their purpose is singular, ancient, and utterly vital, to intercept ultraviolet radiation before it can destroy what lies beneath. They do this by producing melanin, a dark, complex molecule born of tyrosine and enzymes, spun into tiny packets and handed off like armour to the surrounding skin cells. Melanin is not just colour, it is a biological curtain, a veil drawn between the sun and the fragile machinery of DNA. It absorbs, it scatters, it softens the blow. Without it, life on the savannah would be a slow unravelling, and so, human skin, once hidden beneath hair, became a reactive canvas. Where the light was strong, the melanin deepened. Not for beauty, not for fashion, but for function. In places where the sun carved long shadows across dry plains, humans were painted dark by necessity. It was not culture that dictated complexion, but latitude. Solar geometry became biology, but melanin's rise was more than protection. It was a recalibration. By shielding the inner tissues from ultraviolet rays, it preserved something quietly essential, the integrity of folate, a delicate B vitamin molecule floating in the blood. Folate does not announce itself. It does not roar. But it is the silent architect of reproduction, of cell division, of neural tube formation in the unborn. Without it, children are never born, or they are born incomplete. And ultraviolet light, for all its warmth, is a thief. It can cleave folate apart, robbing future generations in ways that leave no immediate scar. Melanin, then, is not just defense. It is fertility. It is memory. It is evolution guarding its most fragile treasure, the unborn child. But how did skin know? How did melanocytes learn to listen to sunlight and translate it into darkness? Because skin is not passive. It senses. It evolves. It remembers. And so, stripped of fur, we did not become vulnerable. We became reactive. We became adaptive. We became creatures who wore their history in visible tones, not as decoration, but as inheritance, written in pigment and passed from mother to child like a prayer against the sun. Because the sun, for all its brilliance, is a paradox. It gives life and quietly threatens it. And in the body, few things are as sensitive to this balance as folate. Folate doesn't make headlines in our cells. It doesn't power muscles or signal nerves. But behind the scenes, it is indispensable, ferrying carbon units, regulating cell division, and constructing the neural tubes that become brains and spines in developing embryos. Without enough folate, conception falters. Growth stalls. Infants are born with devastating defects, and if they're born at all, and ultraviolet light, particularly UVB radiation, degrades folate circulating in the blood. Not in the muscle or bone, but in the skin, where blood vessels run close to the surface, especially in early hominins whose anatomy prioritized cooling through exposed skin. As more blood was brought to the surface for heat exchange, folate-rich plasma was increasingly exposed to solar radiation. This was the evolutionary challenge. The very system that made humans masters of heat, the radiator of bare skin and flushed capillaries, now endangered their reproductive future. The price of cooling, it seemed, was fertility. But evolution, as always, is a sculptor of trade-offs. Enter melanin. By concentrating pigment in the outer layers of the skin, melanocytes created a biochemical umbrella. Not perfect, not total, but substantial. Enough to shield folate from destruction, enough to protect reproduction, enough to let the experiment of bare skin continue. It is here that the story of human skin becomes truly profound, because it is not about colour in the way we understand it today. There were no races in deep time, no boundaries of nation or identity, only gradients of necessity. In regions where sunlight bathed the land year-round, the skin deepened its tone to defend its internal chemistry. In these zones, Central Africa equatorial regions, darkness was survival, and yet there is an irony hidden in this adaptation. Melanin, while protecting folate, also limits another photochemical reaction, one that humans also came to rely on, one that sunlight, in its strange duality, also initiates, the synthesis of vitamin D. Vitamin D, unlike folate, requires sunlight to be created. Specifically, it needs UVB rays to strike cholesterol-derived molecules in the skin and transform them into a precursor, which the liver and kidneys then process into active vitamin D. Without enough of it, bones soften, the immune system weakens, and once humans began migrating away from the equator, into regions with long winters, cloudy skies, or high latitudes, this new requirement began to clash with the old solution. The melanin that once saved lives began to interfere with a new survival need. The skin had to evolve again. Not to erase melanin, but to recalibrate it, to find a new balance between light blocked and light absorbed. Because in the dance between sun and skin, no solution lasts forever. As our ancestors moved, first in small bands, then in growing waves, away from the equatorial cradle of Africa, the light began to change. The sun, still powerful, no longer hung high in the sky all year. It dipped lower at the horizon. Its rays struck at an angle. Seasons arrived, and with them came shadows. Longer, colder, deeper. The brilliant, punishing UVB that once threatened folate now became a scarce and precious resource. But the body didn't forget its dependence. Vitamin D, synthesized from that very UVB light, remained essential, not just for skeletal strength, but for calcium absorption, immune regulation, and mood stability. It governed the mineralization of growing bones. It helped keep infections at bay. It may have even influenced reproductive success. And suddenly, in the cold, fog-drenched climates of Ice Age Europe or high-latitude Asia, the melanin that had once been a shield began to act unintentionally as a barrier. Less UVB reached the skin, less vitamin D was made, and the consequences grew more visible over generations. Rickets, weak bones, deformities, increased mortality in infants. The skin had to change, and so it did. Through the quiet ticking of natural selection, populations in low UV regions began to lose melanin density. The skin lightened, gradually, adaptively, along the latitudinal gradient of sunlight exposure. It was not a sudden or singular change. It occurred in parallel across multiple populations, in multiple places, through different mutations in the same genes. The result was convergent evolution, different routes to the same outcome, lighter skin that could absorb more UVB in dimmer light. It was, in many ways, a reversal of the original adaptation, but not a simple one, because evolution never works with fresh clay. It reshapes what already exists. And so this shift was not a full return to vulnerability, but a compromise. Enough pigment remained to offer some folate protection, but less than before, just enough to allow sufficient vitamin D synthesis. The balance between the two needs, folate preservation and vitamin D production, became a moving target, a molecular negotiation inscribed in every inch of exposed skin. And yet even this balance came with costs. Light skin offered advantages in low UV, but made people more vulnerable when they returned to intense sun, as some later populations did. Migration, again and again, retested the equation, and with clothing, shelter, and cultural adaptation arriving later in prehistory, those balances shifted further still. The skin became not just an organ of physiology, but of geography, of story, of adaptation written in light. Every shade of human skin today is a record of this long journey, a response to the angle of the sun, the cloud of the sky, the nutrients of the diet, and the choices of migration made thousands of generations ago. The skin remembers where we came from, and it tells the world what our ancestors had to solve. Because skin, though silent, is not subtle. It is the first thing we see in one another, and the last thing we ever truly understand. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is too familiar. We mistake it for surface, but in truth, it is history made visible. Each freckle, each mole, each variation in tone and thickness and oil is an echo of a question our ancestors faced. How much sun will reach this land? How much cold will come with winter? What must we preserve? What must we absorb? And over tens of thousands of years, in different corners of the earth, the human body answered these questions in different ways, not by thought, but by inheritance. In some, the skin deepened its hue, layering pigment against an equatorial sun that never relented. In others, it paled, drawing UV inward from a sky grown stingy with light. And in still others, populations that lived under shifting climates, high altitudes, or complex diets, the adaptation moved sideways, relying less on skin and more on behavior, dietary vitamin D, animal fat, indoor shelter, seasonal migration. Skin stopped being a single solution. It became a portfolio of strategies. But to the untrained eye, especially in modern times, these adaptations were misread. Skin became a symbol, a label, a fiction of difference. The slow, elegant mathematics of latitude and light were forgotten, replaced by stories of division. Race, as culture framed it, was never biology. It was never the point. Skin never asked to be politicized. It asked only to survive, to stand between sunlight and bloodstream, to protect, to permit, to adjust. It did so without pride, without shame. But the irony of the human condition is this: the very adaptations that helped us live in different lands eventually brought us together again. As people moved, traded, sailed, migrated, and later colonized, skin became a topic of conflict rather than continuity. But beneath that cultural confusion lies a much simpler truth. We are a single species, and our skin, whether dark as volcanic soil or pale as winter mist, is variation within that species, not markers of superiority, not proof of separation, but evidence of our shared adaptability. Our skin is not a flag. It is a filter. It is a solution to different versions of the same ancestral problem. What happens when you lose your fur? You must become clever in other ways. You must learn to build shade, to seek water, to move wisely, and to let your skin do what your fur once did, negotiate with the sun. And if that negotiation takes different forms in different places, it only proves one thing: that we are capable of change, of adaptation, of surviving not just as one people, but as many variants of a single stubborn lineage, shaped by light and bound by time. And yet, for all its functionality, for all the chemistry and adaptation that skin represents, it is also something stranger. something more intimate, because skin is the only organ we see, the only one that touches the world, the only one that feels the wind and holds the warmth of another human being. It is barrier and bridge at once. And in that duality, something beautiful emerges. Because over time, skin became more than survival. It became expression. It blushed in embarrassment. It goosebumped in awe. It wrinkled with laughter and drew tight with grief. It became canvas to tattoos, to ritual scarification, to the pigments of ceremony. Human beings, once stripped of fur, did not hide their vulnerability. They adorned it. They wrote stories on their skin, stories that told others, I belong, I remember, I feel. And beneath every design, every layer of melanin, every adaptation, the same truth pulsed in the dermis. That skin is alive. It breathes. It heals. It listens. You're wearing your ancestors. Every square inch of your skin is a record of the sun they faced, the lands they crossed, the foods they ate, the storms they endured. And whether your complexion traces its heritage to the equator or the Arctic Circle, it is not an accident. It is not a mistake. It is an answer, one that your body is still whispering. Perhaps this is why skin, more than any other feature, has become the site of so many human misunderstandings. It is so visible, and yet so easy to misread. We see skin as a boundary, but biologically it is an interface. It does not separate us from the world, it connects us to it. And just as it responded to light and heat and nutrient pressure in the past, so it still responds today, to touch, to temperature, to trauma and care. Your skin is not just a map of the past, it is a mirror of the present. It flushes when you speak from the heart, it stings when insulted, it tightens when afraid, it softens when held, and beneath that quiet surface the old trade-offs still ripple: vitamin D, folate, melanin, memory. The science of skin is deep, but the story of skin is deeper, because in the end, skin is where the inside meets the outside, where biology becomes biography, where history leaves its fingerprint on the flesh, not to define us, but to remind us that we were once shaped by the sun, that we still are, and that no matter how far we've come, through clothing, through cities, through culture, we are still naked in a way, still exposed to the elements of each other, still learning to read the signals written just beneath the surface, still, in every sense, skin deep. And so we pause here in the warmth of that thought before we go farther, because the next part of this story begins not with the sun, but with movement, with motion, with the chase. Nakedness is not absence. It is invitation. It is exposure. It is truth, unshielded. When our ancestors lost their fur, they did not simply shed a coat. They opened themselves to the world in a new way. The naked human body, unlike that of any other great ape, became a canvas upon which emotion, health, arousal, stress, and joy could be silently projected. Skin became a language, not of words, but of colour, temperature, moisture, and movement. And in this quiet fluency, something remarkable unfolded. Because in the world of primates, much is concealed by fur. Muscles flex and tension ripples beneath the pelt, but little is visible beyond posture and sound. But with us, with humans, the body itself became a signal, a living reactive screen, flushed cheeks, pale lips, sweating palms, gooseflesh across the forearms, a shiver, a tremble, a sudden stillness, all of it, data, all of it, story. What happens when the body's no longer hidden? You begin to watch each other, you begin to interpret, to anticipate, to respond. Human social life, as it would come to be, depended not just on brains or tools, but on this rich tapestry of visible cues. We became interpreters of micro-expression, of posture and hue, of moisture and scent. Our survival began to rely not only on the tools in our hands, but on the feelings in our faces. And when the fur disappeared, those feelings became luminous. This visibility had its dangers. To be seen is to be vulnerable. To be transparent is to be readable, and perhaps to be rejected. But evolution found an answer not in retreat, but in refinement. It doubled down on expression. Over time, the neurology of empathy expanded. Mirror neurons bloomed in the human cortex, allowing one person's experience to echo inside another's. A flushed face could trigger concern. A widened eye could spark alarm. Blushing, unique to our species, became a wordless confession of shame, attraction, guilt, or embarrassment. Blood itself, summoned to the face, became part of communication. And so, the body was no longer just a shell. It was a living mirror. What kind of creature survives not by hiding its inner state, but by revealing it? What kind of society forms around signals written in flesh? In a sense, we did not lose our fur. We traded it for connection, for confession, for communication. And this trade, like all the others in our evolutionary history, was a gamble, one that made us exquisitely sensitive to one another, one that meant our bodies could no longer lie as easily, that anger would redden the skin, that fear would drain it, that love would bring warmth to the face and softness to the eyes. Without fur, we became more visible, not just to predators, but to each other, and that visibility changed everything, because when the body is bared, touch becomes a conversation. In the animal kingdom, grooming is a ritual, a sign of alliance, hierarchy, reconciliation. But in furred creatures, grooming is practical, a way to remove parasites, to clean, to maintain bonds through careful plucking and licking. In humans, with no fur to groom, the ritual remained, but changed its shape. It became stroking, caressing, holding. And with these new gestures came new emotions. Skin-on-skin touch awakened something deeper than hygiene. It became a tool for calm, for connection, for emotional regulation. A mother's hand on her child's back, a lover's palm across the chest, a friend's grip around the shoulder in grief. These touches carried meaning, subtle yet profound. The naked skin received them all like messages written in warmth, and it was not just touch that grew in importance, but the entire choreography of the body. Without fur, muscles beneath the skin were revealed. Facial expressions became more legible, a twitch of the lip, the narrowing of an eye, the clenching of a jaw. These tiny signals, once hidden beneath dense hair, now played out in full view. This visual fluency became part of our survival. It allowed for communication without sound, for warnings given with a glance, for alliances formed with a look. Blushing in particular emerged as a uniquely human phenomenon, an involuntary signal of emotion that betrays our inner world to others. Blushing cannot be controlled, it cannot be faked, and that may be precisely why it became evolutionarily valuable. In a world where cooperation required trust, where deception could fracture fragile social bonds, blushing served as a truth-teller. It let others know that we felt guilt, or admiration, or embarrassment. It was a kind of social honesty written directly into the capillaries. To reveal emotion, truly, involuntarily, is to expose weakness, but it is also to invite empathy. And in a social species, empathy is strength. Consider the face. No other part of the body carries so much communicative weight, and without fur it became a theatre, capable of infinite nuance. The raised eyebrow, the furrowed brow, the subtle tightening of the lips, all of these over evolutionary time became part of a shared vocabulary, not taught but felt. And it wasn't only emotion that was read on the skin. Health, too, left its signature. Pale, clammy skin signalled illness. Reddened skin could indicate fever or exertion. Flush could mean warmth, or desire, or danger. In this way, the body broadcast its status constantly, whether we wanted it to or not. This openness, this unavoidable honesty, was made possible by the loss of fur. In shedding our coats, we did not just survive the heat. We built a new kind of society, one where every gesture, every colour shift, every quiver of muscle told a story. But skin did not only speak in the language of emotion, it also signalled something far more practical, something ancient and urgent: cleanliness. For all their warmth and protection, fur coats come with a price. Among mammals, and especially social primates, fur can be a haven for parasites. Fleas, lice, ticks, and mites. They nest, they feed, they irritate, and they spread disease. In dense groups living closely together, these infestations become more than a nuisance. They become a threat. Early humans, by shedding their fur, may have gained an invisible advantage in this struggle. Exposed skin made parasites easier to detect and remove. A tick is far simpler to spot on a smooth thigh than buried deep in a tangled mat of hair, and once spotted, easier to flick off, to crush, to avoid altogether. This shift likely had compounding benefits. Fewer parasites meant fewer infections. Fewer infections meant stronger bodies, more energy, and more surviving offspring. And in a species that began to live in ever larger groups, cooking together, sleeping in clusters, raising children cooperatively, disease control became a communal concern. Less fur may have been a form of biological hygiene, and as our ancestors developed more sophisticated tools, they began to extend this hygiene with behaviour, scraping the skin, washing with water, applying ash or mud or plant resins. Clothing, when it arrived, was not the return of a pelt but its reinvention, removable, replaceable, cleanable. A fur coat could not be laundered, a linen tunic could. There is also a theory, still debated, but quietly compelling, that losing fur may have altered our scent. Fur traps odours. Sebaceous glands, sweat, and the oils of the skin create a cocktail of smells that linger in the hair. In many mammals, this scent serves as a social signal, identity, readiness to mate, dominance. But in humans, the loss of fur may have reduced the intensity of these olfactory cues. Instead, we leaned more into sight and touch, and less into scent. We became a visually social species. We still smell, of course, but subtly. Less fur, less scent, fewer parasites, more touch. Each of these changes nudged us toward a new kind of intimacy. A nearness that wasn't just tolerated, but welcomed. And perhaps that too became part of our survival, because cooperation, true cooperation, requires proximity. It requires safety and closeness. And the skin, left open and bare, became not only a sensor but a statement. I am clean. I am safe to touch. In the world of prehistoric humans, that message may have mattered as much as any tool or fire. It allowed us to live together, to trust each other, to build networks of contact that were not only social, but biological. Without fur, we became touchable, and in that touch something essential was passed. Not just warmth, or comfort, or reassurance, though all of those flowed freely through human hands, but something older, something foundational, trust. The naked human body, stripped of fur, needed other humans, needed care. Needed attention. It became a body that could not hide. And that transparency demanded new tools for survival, cooperation, empathy, awareness. In a world without fur, grooming didn't disappear. It transformed. No longer confined to nitpicking through hair, it became the quiet gestures of affection and alliance, the rub of a shoulder, the massaging of tired feet, the soft pressure of fingers over a wound. And with these gestures came a new kind of memory, tactile memory. You remembered who held you when you were ill, who soothed you during grief, who reached out first in forgiveness. Skin, once a barrier, became a ledger, a living record of care. This shift had profound effects on our species. For primates with fur, grooming reinforces hierarchies. The powerful are groomed more often. But in humans, touch began to escape that hierarchy. It became mutual, reciprocal. It flowed between parent and child, between siblings, between friends, between lovers. And as these tactile rituals deepened, so too did our need to ritualize them. We painted the skin, marked it, stained it with ochre, ink, clay, adorned it with jewelry, with feathers, with scars. Our hairlessness did not stop us from decorating the body. It invited us to. A furred animal carries its identity in its coat, its species, its sex, its health. But a human being, naked of fur, had space for something new, self-expression. Here, on this body, I show you who I am. I mark my coming of age. I mourn my dead. I belong to this group. I believe in this story. The body became a stage, a scroll, a message, and this openness, this constant exposure, also changed how we loved. In furred animals, mating displays often involve scent and posture. In humans, they became visual. We watched the eyes, the lips, the hips, the subtle colour of the skin, the dilation of pupils, the slight sheen of sweat. Sexual attraction, courtship, desire. These were written into the skin as clearly as any language. And the more we learned to read them, the more skin became central to who we were. But there was a cost. To be hairless is to be fragile. The sun bites harder, the cold sinks faster, the thorns and insects find their mark more easily, and the social risks are real too. To blush is to betray feeling. To pale is to show fear. To tremble is to reveal vulnerability. And yet, we did not evolve to hide these things. We evolved to live with them, to see them in one another, and to respond. This is perhaps the most powerful consequence of our nakedness, that we are creatures who react not only to threat or comfort, but to each other's honesty, to what cannot be hidden. We lost our fur and gained our faces. We lost our coats and gained our gestures. We exposed the body, and in doing so, we exposed the self. Skin is not just a physiological surface. It is a social one. It is where inner life becomes visible, where anger pulses, where tears rise, where laughter folds the eyes, where grief leaves its pallor. And in a world of exposed bodies, we evolved not to look away, but to look closer, to recognize when someone needed help, to know, even before a word is spoken, when someone is afraid, to feel, in the warmth of another's hand, that they are still with us. The social skin turned our bodies into instruments of empathy, into conductors of closeness, into beacons for emotion. And it's still happening in every handshake, every hug, every brush of arms in a crowded room, in the goosebumps that rise during music, in the shiver of awe beneath the stars, in the press of a child's head against your chest. These are not just sensory events. They are reminders that we are wired to connect, that our skin, so soft, so thin, so open, is not a weakness. It is a feature, a design, a gift. Even today, in our layers of fabric and digital avatars, the skin remembers. It remembers the evolutionary story written into every pore. To survive, feel, to thrive, reveal. And maybe that's what makes the human body so haunting and so beautiful. It is not fur that makes us strong. It is exposure. Not armor, but openness. Not concealment, but presence. And so, when you look at another person's face, at the wrinkle in their brow or the curve of their smile or the flush creeping up their neck, you are seeing millions of years of adaptation. Not for the hunt, not for escape, but for recognition, to be seen and known, to let the inside show. In this way, the skin became our first mirror and our first message, and through it, we learned something astonishing, that vulnerability can be strength, that openness can build trust, that contact, far from being optional, is vital. So the next time your hand finds another, or your cheek warms with emotion, or your body trembles in the presence of beauty, remember this: you were designed for this, not to be hidden, but to be felt. And in the next part of our story, we'll follow this thread of openness to where it leads, to the ways our skin, once made bare, shaped not just emotion and intimacy, but culture, identity, and the very idea of being human. Before we were thinkers, we were runners. Before we were philosophers and poets and engineers, we were shadows on the plains, lean, hairless, relentless. Imagine it, a pale, two-legged shape on the horizon, not faster than the antelope it chases, not stronger than the zebra it trails, but one thing above all, steady. In heat that curls the air and scorches the earth, it keeps moving. While the hooves gallop and the hearts race and the lungs of prey burn with panic, the figure does not stop, because we were never meant to win the race by speed. We were meant to outlast it. This is the quiet genius of the naked human body, not in its grace or its elegance, but in its refusal to quit. And nowhere is this more evident than in the ancient strategy called persistence hunting. The method is brutally simple. You start running in the morning, you find the track of an animal, often a grazing ungulate, and you follow it. You read the prints, the scuff of hooves, the scent on the air, the signs in the brush. You run. The animal sprints away. You walk, you jog. You find it again. It sprints again. But eventually, maybe after hours, maybe after 10 miles, it begins to fail. Because quadrupeds overheat. Their breathing is limited by their gait. The faster they run, the less they can pant. Their internal temperatures climb, and in the merciless sun of the African savanna their bodies cannot dump heat fast enough. But ours can. This is the evolutionary deal we made when we shed our fur. We became, perhaps, the most heat-efficient hunters on Earth. With nearly 5 million sweat glands spread across the skin and no insulating layer of fur to trap it, The human body becomes a living radiator. With every drop of sweat evaporating into the dry air, we pull heat from the blood, cool the core, and carry on. But sweating alone is not enough. Without fur, the sun can sear our backs, dehydrate our cells, damage our DNA. So evolution gave us another gift: dark skin, rich in melanin, able to absorb and deflect the ultraviolet onslaught, preserving the delicate systems beneath. In this way, the skin becomes a paradox, both a barrier and a vent, both shield and sieve. And so, under the African sun, a new kind of predator took shape, one that didn't need claws, one that didn't need to pounce, one that could simply wait and run and wait again. What must it have felt like, not to strike, but to endure, to catch your prey not in a blur of violence but in the quiet collapse of exhaustion, to make your body an extension of the heat, the landscape, the wind itself? What kind of mind is shaped by that chase? What kind of soul? Because this kind of hunting is not just physical, it is mental, it is social, it is a choreography of attention. To track an animal across a savanna is to read a story in dust. It's not a single trail like footprints in snow. It's a layered living document, scattered prints, broken blades of grass, heat-hardened dung, a snapped twig, the shift of birds overhead. And to follow it, you need a kind of literacy that goes beyond language. You need memory, pattern recognition, empathy. You must think like the prey. Where would it veer for shade? Where would it panic? How tired is it now? How long since it last drank? What would you do if you were prey and the air burned and your legs ached and your heart pounded too hard? The hunter begins to carry the mind of another being. It's not a casual task. It requires presence. And it rarely happens alone. Persistence hunting, while sometimes done by solo individuals, is, at its most effective, a team pursuit. Groups of hunters fan out across the plain, communicating with subtle calls or glances. They take turns tracking. They triangulate. They share knowledge. One saw fresh prints. Another heard movement to the east. One drops back for water. Another pushes forward. The kill, if it comes, is shared. But so is the effort, and this is what truly separates the naked hunter from the feline, from the raptor, from the solitary ambush predator. We didn't just evolve to chase, we evolved to cooperate. Fur would have hidden much of this, the sweat, the fatigue, the subtle signals of motion. But bare skin speaks. When someone is tiring, you see it. When someone's shoulders tense or their steps falter, or their skin turns pale, the group knows. And when a runner returns, flushed and breathing hard, but points with one darkened finger to the horizon, the others follow. This is where speech may have begun. Not in the abstract, but in the immediate. A gesture, a grunt, a rhythmic call, the cadence of movement shared in sound. Perhaps it started with tracking calls, short, clipped, urgent. Perhaps it began with running songs, breath-timed phrases that held the beat of pursuit. We don't know for sure. But we do know this. Cooperation was the crucible in which language was forged, and the hunt, long, hot, unforgiving, was its furnace. To run together, to read together, to chase something larger than yourself. That is where the naked hunters began to become human. They were not fast, they were not fierce, but they were persistent, and they were together. And under the harshest sun they began to carve something new into the savannah. Not just footprints, but memory, strategy, and story. Because to hunt this way, across miles of shifting terrain, under skies that offered no shelter, through days of uncertainty, was not just to chase prey. It was to bind people. Persistence hunting is not a task for the solitary. It requires more than lungs and legs. It requires roles, structure, trust. One runner follows the spoor. Another carries water. Another waits with children tending the embers of the campfire. These were not just bodies moving across land. These were systems, early blueprints of society. And slowly, something remarkable begins to unfold. Planning. To chase a gazelle for 8 hours requires more than instinct. It requires foresight, the decision to leave at dawn, the awareness of distance and heat, the memory of past hunts, the knowledge of when an animal will bolt, when it will tire, where it will fall. These are not reactive skills, they are predictive, and they are shared. The knowledge of prey movement, the skills of tracking, the routes to water, the stories of past kills, all passed on, in voice, in gesture, in the scars of knees and the calluses of feet. In this way, the hunt became not just a means of survival, but a vessel of culture, and at the centre of it all, the naked body. No fur to insulate, no claws to kill, no fangs to tear. Just a brain, a plan, and a community. But stripped of natural defences, humans had to lean into something else, into mutual reliance. If one faltered, the others carried. If one lost the trail, another picked it up. If one succeeded, all ate. And in this web of needs and contributions, a new kind of strength was born. Not the strength of the lion, but the strength of the many. Resilience by connection. And connection brings vulnerability. Not just physical, but emotional. The pain of loss, the fear of hunger, the joy of reunion, the triumph of a shared kill. These are not solitary feelings. They bloom in the presence of others. They require witness. And so, skin, once just a barrier, became a canvas of expression, flushed with pride, tightened in tension, loosened in laughter. In this openness, bonds were formed, bonds that outlasted the hunt, and the hunt itself became something more than a strategy. It became a rite, a test, a performance of roles: runner, tracker, water-bearer, butcher, each one vital, each one visible. Over time, these roles calcified into structure, into gendered tasks, into hierarchies, into traditions, the early threads of ritual and expectation. We may not know their names, these hunters, but we walk in their path. Every act of collaboration, every shared effort, every plan made for the future. These are their echoes. The naked hunter was not alone, they ran with others, and together they changed not just their bodies, but the very shape of what it meant to survive. To be human was now to be held, by others, by story, by the hunt itself. And there, beneath the brutal sun, a strange paradox emerged. For all its physical hardship, the hunt became something more than toil. It became rhythm, a way of being, a shape of consciousness that unfolded across land and heat and hours, a form of movement that was also a form of meditation. Step after step, breath after breath, the pulse of the body in sync with the path. When you run for hours, alone or with others, a strange stillness arrives. The voice in your head grows quiet, your thoughts flatten, the body takes over, attention narrows, and something ancient wakes up inside you. Not just instinct, but presence. And in that presence, you feel the land. You notice things you would otherwise ignore. The angle of the wind, the change in bird calls, the way a stone is warmed only on one side. The world becomes a sensorium, vast, immediate, alive. This is what the hunt taught us. Not just how to kill, but how to attend. Because unlike ambush predators, we did not wait in stillness. We moved, and unlike scavengers, we did not stumble on meals. We earned them, with focus, memory, patience. And this sharpened us. The brain, once wired for climbing and grabbing, began to change. New circuits fired. Planning, mapping, interpreting signs, these became vital. And with them came abstraction, imagination, the seeds of what would one day become art, language, even ritual. Because to run for hours in silence, in tandem with others, chasing something that may or may not appear, that is faith. That is story, that is meaning. The naked hunter was not just a killer. They were a pilgrim, and the plains were not just a stage. They were a teacher. They taught the body how to endure. They taught the group how to stay close. They taught the mind how to wander, then return. Even the animal, the prey, was a kind of mirror. To hunt it was to study it, to know its fears, its strengths, its paths. And in that study, a strange kind of reverence sometimes emerged. A respect not for the kill, but for the chase, for the effort. Some anthropologists argue that early humans must have seen animals not only as food, but as teachers, spirits, carriers of knowledge. Because to track something for a full day is to learn it deeply, its habits, its rhythms, its soul. This intimacy with prey may have been the root of myth, the beginnings of belief. The sense that life was not random but patterned, knowable, tied together in some great web, and in that web the naked hunter once vulnerable and slow, became something new. Not just a survivor, but a seeker. And perhaps that's the quiet truth at the centre of this transformation, that when we lost our fur, we didn't just gain an evolutionary edge, we gained a kind of exposure, not only to the sun and wind, but to each other, to vulnerability, to shared dependence. And in that exposure, we became more than animals surviving the heat. We became beings navigating meaning. The body stripped of fur became a message board, of exhaustion, of joy, of fear, of intent. Skin turned us outward, and the hunt turned us inward. It's worth remembering that endurance hunting kills, while dramatic and celebrated, did not occur in every climate or region. It was a strategy born in specific ecological conditions, hot, open, unforgiving. But what it ignited within those zones was something lasting, something portable. The habits of cooperation, the capacity for foresight, the willingness to push beyond the moment. These are not traits limited to the plains. They became embedded in us, and they travelled. Even as our ancestors migrated north, even as forest returned and prey patterns changed, the social instincts honed in the heat remained. The ability to move together, to plan, to divide labour, to share not just calories, but knowledge. That knowledge in time would evolve into language, into tools, into stories told beside firelight, of long chases and hard-won meals. And around those fires children would listen, futures would be imagined, the shape of what it meant to be human would continue to evolve. But here, in this chapter of our becoming, we were still close to the ground, still panting, still coated in salt and dust, still barefoot on the savannah, with only the thinnest layer of skin between us and the burning world, and somehow that nakedness didn't diminish us. It defined us. In losing fur, we became fluid, able to cool, to sweat, to move. In exposing skin, we became honest, readable, responsive, alert. And in enduring the heat together, we became bonded, not by might, but by trust. Because that is what the naked hunters truly reveal. Not just a story of biology, but a philosophy of movement, of being shaped by effort, of seeing the world not as something to be conquered, but endured, together. Their footprints are long gone, erased by wind and time. But in every marathon, in every long walk across a desert path, in every exhausted face looking to the horizon with determination, they flicker back to life. We still run, not because we must, but because something deep within us remembers. The heat, the rhythm, the breath of others beside us, the chase, not as violence, but as communion. And so the chapter closes, not with a kill, but with a horizon. Still distant, still shimmering, still calling. What happens when a child can no longer cling to their mother's body? Strip away our assumptions, strip away our clothes, strip away the skin's illusion of permanence. Beneath all that, beneath the evolutionary headlines and the great dramas of fire and stone, lies a quiet and deeply human mystery. One that begins not with the hunter, but the held. For in the vast tapestry of mammalian life, nearly every infant is born ready to cling, to grasp, to nestle against a coat of warmth. Fur is not merely protection, it is anchor and comfort and cradling touch. But humans, alone among the apes, took that anchor away. Look closely at a human newborn, weak, soft, nearly blind, more helpless than a chimp, more dependent than a bonobo, with hands that search for something that is no longer there. What happens then when the fur disappears? In evolutionary terms, it means the infant can no longer ride, it cannot grip its mother's back, it cannot hold itself in place through forest or savanna. The body of the caregiver is no longer a stable platform, it is a surface of slipping skin, and so something must shift, and it did. Archaeologists and anthropologists call it a revolution in arms. With fur gone, mothers had to carry their babies with their hands pressed close to chest and belly. This simple act, holding, always holding, transformed the way we moved, the way we bonded, the way we organised our time and labour. Because if one arm is always cradling, it cannot throw a spear. If two arms are full of child, they cannot gather wood, or climb, or dig. So now ask the real question. Who helped? Because somewhere along this silent axis, the myth of the lone mother began to crack. Could it be that the disappearance of fur millions of years ago, triggered a cascade of social innovation. Could our smooth skin have demanded that care become shared, extended, more human? This is where the question turns from biology to story. In primates, paternal investment is rare. Males compete, protect, display. But raise, feed, nurture, that is unusual, and yet in humans something changes. Somewhere along our path, fathers began to stay, to touch, to hold. Why? One theory suggests it begins here, in the cradling, in the shared act of keeping a child close to the skin. With no fur to cling to, infants needed arms. With 2 arms not always enough, others had to step in. Grandmothers, siblings, fathers. A circle began to form around the child, not merely a mother, but a community. And perhaps this was not a sacrifice. Perhaps this was a mirror. What if skin-to-skin contact did more than comfort the infant? What if it changed the adult as well? Because in the soft press of warm skin, something ancient stirs, something biochemical. The quiet flooding of oxytocin, the lowering of cortisol, the invisible but measurable shift that turns mere contact into connection. Skin, in this light, is not a neutral surface. It is a transmitter, a medium of emotion and regulation, a place where biology and intimacy meet. And for the first time in the story of primates, males began to linger in that space, not all at once, not everywhere. But somewhere in our long history, paternal behaviour began to emerge, not merely in the form of protection or provision, but in touch, in proximity, in presence. This is not conjecture, but pattern. Across forager societies where infant care is shared, fathers often carry, coo and cradle their young. Among the Aka of Central Africa, fathers hold their babies almost as often as mothers do. Among the Hadza, men play and soothe, not as secondary supports but as essential parts of the nurturing rhythm. And here again, skin matters. Without fur, the infant's senses turn fully to skin, to temperature, to scent, to the heartbeat beneath the chest. And in that touch, they regulate, they calm, they attach. But the adult does too, because the act of holding a child is not passive. It shapes the nervous system, it tunes the brain, it deepens social awareness. Studies show that caregivers, especially male caregivers, experience hormonal changes when they engage in close contact. Drops in testosterone, rises in prolactin. The body prepares itself, not for battle, but for patience, for caretaking. It is tempting to think that evolution selects for strength alone, but here we see another form of strength, a capacity for softness. And maybe that's what the loss of fur demanded, a culture that made space for more than the strong, one that valued those who could hold, tend, respond, not just the hunter, but the holder. Because with skin exposed, protection takes new forms, not only from weather and predators, but from abandonment, from neglect, from overstimulation. The naked infant is not just physically vulnerable, it is neurologically open. Its brain is still under construction, still forming maps from every glance, every touch. And in that state, human connection becomes architecture, each cuddle a brick, each lullaby a beam. And perhaps that is where fathers entered, slowly, uncertainly, but meaningfully. Not to replace mothers, but to expand the circle. Because the skin, bare and open, created new needs, and those needs created new roles. And those roles, those tiny acts of presence and contact, may have quietly rewired the arc of our species. The naked child could not hold on, so we learned to hold each other. And as we did, something extraordinary unfolded, not just in the family unit, but in the shape of society itself. Because the bare-skinned infant, unable to cling, did more than demand care. It demanded coordination. In primate groups, infant carrying is a solitary act. The mother grips, the infant clings, and life continues. But what happens when that basic loop breaks? What happens when carrying is no longer automatic but active? When arms must be freed and tasks must be shared? What happens is delegation, and delegation is the seed of trust. To hand off a child, even briefly, is an act of vulnerability. It requires belief not only in the other's strength, but in their gentleness, in their ability to read signals, in their willingness to respond. And when that exchange succeeds, when the child is soothed and returned and loved, then a powerful signal is sent. You are safe here, not just in a body, but in a group. Anthropologists call this the cooperative breeding model. It suggests that humans evolved not as isolated dyads, mother and infant, but as flexible, interdependent webs of caregiving. And while breeding is a cold word, what it points to is tender, the expansion of the caregiving circle beyond biology. In this model, infants are cared for by fathers, siblings, aunts, grandmothers, anyone with the capacity and willingness to nurture. And in many traditional societies, this is exactly what we see. Infants passed from hand to hand not as burdens, but as shared blessings. Once again, skin plays a central role. In this web of arms, skin becomes a bridge. Every contact reaffirms connection. Every warm chest or steady heartbeat reinforces the sense that the world is not random or cold, but rhythmic and responsive and known. And through this contact, emotional development takes root. Because in humans, more than any other species, the infant brain is shaped by interaction. Not just fed or warmed, but attuned. The baby learns what to expect from the world by how it is held. And when many people hold it, when many voices sing and hands soothe, something rich is encoded. Flexibility, social fluency, trust. The loss of fur, seemingly a vulnerability, may have been the quiet lever that turned our families inside out. No longer a closed circuit. Now, a circle. And that circle changed everything. It allowed mothers to recover more quickly. It let fathers bond in ways previously impossible. It brought siblings into contact. It made grandmothers not just useful, but vital. In short, it let culture in. Because when childcare becomes shared, values begin to circulate. Habits, languages, rituals, they are all practiced through care, passed on not just by word, but by touch. And so it was that the hairless child became the centre of the first human network. Not just fed, not just protected, but known. And in that knowing, soft, repetitive, unspoken, the architecture of emotion began to take form. Human babies are born not ready, but unfinished. Compared to other mammals, even other primates, our gestation is strangely incomplete. The brain doubles in size after birth. The immune system is naive, the skeleton is soft, and the regulation of emotion, that uniquely human dance between inner state and outer signal, requires months, even years, of calibration. And skin is how it begins. Skin-to-skin contact is now a standard practice in modern neonatal care, but its roots are ancient. When a baby is placed on a caregiver's bare chest, the body responds. Heart rates synchronize. Stress hormones drop. The infant's breathing becomes more regular. Even blood sugar stabilizes. This is not magic. It is mammalian design, awakened. And it does not only shape the infant, the adult changes too. The parent who engages in this closeness develops greater sensitivity, faster responsiveness, a deeper sense of attunement. The boundary between bodies softens, and in that softening a relationship is formed, not just of biology, but of trust. When we lost our fur, we lost the automatic contact that many other mammals rely on. But in its absence, we gained the opportunity for deliberate connection, to choose to hold, to choose to comfort, to build intimacy not by reflex but by intent. And intent matters, because human development isn't just about surviving infancy. It's about learning how to feel, how to relate, how to belong. These lessons are not taught with words, especially not in the early months. They are taught with tone, with gaze, with the warmth of skin against skin. Touch, when it is safe and consistent, builds what psychologists call secure attachment. It is the inner knowing that someone will come when you cry. That comfort is not conditional, that closeness is not scarce, and secure attachment in turn creates resilient adults. People who can regulate emotion, form stable relationships, navigate social nuance. It all begins with how we are held, and so we must return again to our earliest ancestors, arms full of helpless children, skin exposed to the elements and to each other. What began as a practical necessity, the need to carry an unclinging infant, rippled outward into the very structure of our emotional worlds. Could it be that the human capacity for empathy, for cooperation, for care, has its roots in the bare vulnerability of our skin? Could it be that our most defining trait as a species, our deep social mind, was sculpted in part by the need to hold, by the need to be held, the infant could not cling. So we began to cling to each other, in laughter, in grief, in community. And in doing so, we began to become something new, not just a clever primate, but a profoundly connected one. That connection, born not of dominance or display, but of vulnerability, would go on to define us. It shaped the way we raised children, the way we formed families, the way we imagined one another, and it began, perhaps, in something as simple and as strange as the nakedness of a newborn with nothing to grasp. That one fact echoes like a soft drumbeat beneath every advance that followed, because it wasn't only about survival, it was about presence, the presence of others, the invitation to touch, to respond, to stay. Hairlessness, in this view, wasn't a subtraction. It was an exposure, an opening, an evolutionary call that said, this one cannot go it alone, and so we didn't. We leaned toward each other. We invented ways to carry, slings, wraps, cradles of bark and hide. We built language around need, hunger, cold, comfort, fear. And in many places, fathers, once peripheral in the primate story, became central figures in the human one. Not in every culture, not in every age. But the pattern is persistent. Across continents, in the most ancient foraging societies, we see evidence of fathers who carry, fathers who co-sleep, fathers who respond not just with protection, but with presence. And this shift changes everything. Because when fathers stay close, something else stabilizes. The emotional ecology of the group. Children feel safer, partners feel supported. The burden of care is not one person's to bear. It is distributed, across kin, across community, across generations. Even our myths began to change. Stories of powerful mothers were joined by stories of nurturing fathers, gods who cradled, kings who wept, men whose strength was measured not in war alone but in compassion. These were not universal tales, but they became possible tales. Tales born from a species that had rewired the meaning of care. And all of this perhaps because the infant could no longer hold on by itself. Evolution doesn't make moral judgments. It doesn't plan, but it does respond. And the human response to vulnerability, especially in our own young, was not to discard, but to draw near, to hold tighter, to become more tender, to change the structure of our families, our tribes, our myths. And so, in the story of human evolution, we find this quiet chapter, one not about tools or teeth or terrain, but about touch, about the strange skin-borne chain reaction that may have transformed not only our biology, but our bonds. The fur disappeared, and in its place, the hand, the chest, the embrace. And through that embrace, a new kind of father, a new kind of family, the beginning perhaps of what makes us most human. Not that we run fast, not that we think far, but that we stay close, that we hold each other, even when there's nothing left to hold on to. At first, there was only skin, exposed, unsheltered, whispering our biology to the elements. And then, slowly, we began to wrap ourselves in the world. This is the paradox of the naked ape, that in shedding our fur we made room for culture. We became the species that clothed itself, not just for warmth, not just for modesty, but for meaning. Our vulnerability invited invention, and that invention transformed us. But when did it begin? What moment first divided us from the open air, not just in biology, but in habit? Somewhere between 1 and 200,000 years ago, the needle moves, not in cloth, not in wool or leather, but in bone. The oldest sewing tools known to archaeology, awls, pointed bone fragments, the ghost of a design, appear in South Africa's border cave and in sites scattered across Eurasia. These were not for tents or shelters. They were small, personal, likely used to pierce skins and wrap them around bodies. And those bodies, they were changing. As Homo sapiens left Africa and moved into colder latitudes, the cost of nudity rose. Paleolithic winters did not forgive exposed flesh, and yet, even before these harsh climates, we see signs that the idea of covering was already alive. Lice tell us this story. Not the ones that live in hair, but the ones that live in clothing. Clothing lice, genetically distinct from scalp lice, can only survive in garments. and their divergence from their hairy cousins is a timestamp in DNA, a quiet molecular diary. Genetic studies suggest they split from the head louse lineage somewhere between 80 and 170,000 years ago, which means, quite simply, we had clothes. We wore them. We stitched or bound together hides, wrapped bark and woven grass, placed fur against skin in the absence of our own. And in doing so, we crossed a threshold. No longer was the body a solitary frontier. It became a surface upon which the external world was layered, intentionally, symbolically, with care or creativity or control. What happens to a species when the outer shell becomes a choice? When weather becomes negotiable? When the tools of survival are not grown but made? This is not just a shift in adaptation, it is a shift in autonomy. The moment we began clothing ourselves was the moment we began customizing the terms of our exposure, and that act, covering, layering, sculpting the silhouette, became its own kind of language. A language not just of need, but of self. But selfhood is never neutral. If the naked body reveals, then the clothed body conceals or declares. In wrapping our forms, we did not erase our vulnerability. We edited it. We reframed it. We began to decide which parts of us were shown and which were hidden. And in that choice, a new kind of power. A power to craft not just what we are, but how we are seen. That shift, from body to message, would echo across the millennia. What began as protection became performance. What began as necessity became identity. Long before agriculture, long before writing, there was adornment. Even in the earliest human settlements, we find evidence of bodies that were not just clothed, but curated. Perforated shells worn as necklaces, strips of ochre, rubbed into skin or smeared into fabric, beads made from bone, ivory, and even the teeth of animals. These artifacts predate pottery. They predate architecture. Some are older than the paintings on cave walls. They tell us something very simple and very human, that we were already more than ourselves. We were sending signals. Look here, they said. This is my group, my kin, my age, my role, my ritual. The shell pressed into the chest or tied to the wrist was not just pretty, it was communicative, it meant something. Adornment was clothing's cousin, and in many cases it was clothing. A band of beads across the waist, a loop of fibre across the shoulders. These were not garments in the modern sense, but they marked the body. They altered its shape. They called attention, or granted privacy. They transformed a naked frame into a social one, and it is worth pausing here to reflect on what that means. Because unlike fur, which is inherited, clothing is shared. It is taught. It is passed down. It is made. A young animal is born with its coat. A young human must be wrapped, dressed, adorned. In that act, culture is born. It is not coded in genes. It is encoded in hands, in tradition, in the small repetitions of daily life, and those repetitions become rules. A certain colour is worn during mourning. A particular animal skin marks a coming of age. A braided belt distinguishes the married from the unwed. Over time, these distinctions solidify, and with them, the social structure takes shape. Clothing becomes boundary, clothing becomes invitation, clothing becomes map. But not every map leads to peace, because just as clothing allows for expression, it also allows for exclusion. To dress differently is to stand apart. To be undressed, or dressed wrong, is to risk shame, suspicion, or even danger. Identity, once made visible, can be judged, and with judgment comes hierarchy. Still, we must remember, this was not a mistake. It was a possibility. The loss of fur did not simply reveal the body, it created a canvas. And on that canvas, humans began to paint their affiliations, their roles, their beliefs. They began to say, I am one of you, or I am not. And in doing so, the naked body, once uniform, became unique. Each body, a story. Each story dressed. But dressing a story is never a neutral act. What we choose to cover, and what we choose to expose, rewrites the meaning of what lies beneath. And over time, those choices begin to shape not only how we see each other, but how we see ourselves. Clothing didn't just change the body, it changed how the body was imagined. Consider the shift from exposure to concealment. in a species once defined by its openness, bare skin, visible signals, unhidden wounds, the act of hiding became transformative. The covered body became mysterious, private, sexualized, protected, vulnerable. Suddenly, a shoulder could scandalize, a hip could seduce, a scar could disappear beneath linen never to be spoken of again. And this too was culture, a culture of interpretation, of modesty or power or taboo, where once every body was more or less equally visible. Now each culture chose what was sacred, what was shameful, and what was celebrated. In some societies, the chest remained uncovered, but the hair was veiled. In others, the face was concealed, but jewellery marked the arms, the legs, the ears, and always, in nearly every place, the meaning shifted with time, with season, with ritual. A single piece of clothing could signal mourning one day, and fertility the next. A strip of fabric could be armour, uniform, ornament, or cage. The body became a stage, and the clothing, its choreography. This reframing of the body brought with it a new kind of consciousness, not just about the weather or survival, but about beauty, about presentation, about the standards we invented to define what was proper, what was fitting, what was attractive. These ideas were not written into our DNA, they were stitched into our stories. And as they passed down, mother to daughter, elder to youth, priest to people, they took on the weight of law. A law not of physics but of meaning. A law of who could wear what, when and why. Through this, the body became something to manage, to display or to disguise, to adorn or to discipline. Skin, once our outermost organ of survival, was slowly reframed as something else, a surface to curate, to conceal, to define. And with that curation came anxiety. To be too exposed was dangerous. To be covered in the wrong way or at the wrong time could be dangerous too. And so the act of dressing, which had once been innovation, became a ritual, a daily meditation on belonging, visibility and power. But power always has a cost, and the cost of clothing perhaps was this, that the body, once wild and open, now lived beneath layers not just of fibre, but of expectation. But those layers did more than shift perception. They shifted possibility. Because once we learned to wear the world, we learned to leave our ecological birthplace behind. We were no longer confined to the warm cradle of equatorial Africa. With skins wrapped around skin, we crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and wandered into frozen steppes. Clothing became our passport to new climates, a second skin that moved with us, adapted with us, and insulated us against the unfamiliar. Fire may have warmed us, but clothing followed us into motion. Even the earliest migrations out of Africa, through the Levant, into Central Asia, across tundra and taiga, were buffered by hides, cloaks, and later woven plant fibres. And as our technologies grew, so did our ambition. The tailoring of clothing became more refined. Needles with eyes, fastenings and belts, fitted garments. Clothing stopped being just draped and started being shaped. We began to sculpt what had once merely covered. Form met function, and fashion long before cities or mirrors or runways was born. But the consequences were deeper than style. They were biological. Clothing changed the skin's exposure to light, which meant it changed our relationship to ultraviolet radiation, which meant it influenced how, and how much, we synthesized vitamin D. And over time, as populations settled in higher latitudes, skin tones lightened, adapting to ensure enough UV could penetrate through to the bloodstream even beneath partial coverings. Our biology began responding not just to the sun, but to the fabric between us and the sun. In this way, clothing didn't just accompany evolution, it participated in it. It became an environmental factor, a tool that reshaped us, slowly, generationally, without ever touching our DNA directly. And even as it protected us, it brought new vulnerabilities. Fleas and lice found new homes in our garments. Infections grew in moist, trapped areas. Clothing created barriers against the wind, but also against sensation. Bare skin, so central to touch, was now often buffered. And that meant the cues we had evolved to interpret through contact, temperature, social bonding, even arousal, shifted into new forms. We wrapped the body, but in doing so, we distanced the world. To touch another person now required permission. To feel the wind on one's back required undressing. To let rain hit the skin became an act of deliberation, not accident. And so the body, once in constant conversation with the elements, began speaking through new channels. We had clothed ourselves against nature, and in doing so we had started to leave nature. Not entirely, not yet, but symbolically, spiritually. Clothing was our declaration that we would not only adapt to the world, we would begin gently to change its terms. And once we changed the terms, the question became, what does it mean to be human in a body that can be endlessly reshaped? Because when fur was lost and fabric was gained, the body was no longer finished. It became an open project, subject to editing, to ritual, to imagination. The clothed human was no longer just a species, it was a statement. And today, that statement is louder than ever. Modern clothing is layered in meaning. Political, aesthetic, religious, sexual. It still protects, yes. But it also proclaims, it divides, it uplifts, it constrains, it signals allegiance or rebellion, modesty or audacity, wealth or humility, identity or anonymity. It is a language we speak with our bodies, and yet beneath it all, still, is the same skin. The same radiant, sweating, breathing organ that once stood exposed to the equatorial sun. The same canvas that once bore scars and stories without the filter of fibre. The same membrane that evolution honed for survival, and that culture later wrapped in mystery. This is the paradox of our nakedness. We are the unclothed ape that could not remain unclothed. We are born into skin and almost immediately placed into fabric. The fur we lost became the fabric we wear. But unlike fur, fabric is a choice, and with that choice comes responsibility. To understand how our bodies and our minds are shaped by what we wear. To recognize that clothing is not trivial, it is not cosmetic. It is in many ways one of our most enduring technologies, and like all technologies, it carries consequences. It can liberate, it can restrict, it can celebrate, it can erase. And so when we look in the mirror today at a dressed body, we're not just seeing fashion, we're seeing history, we're seeing survival, we're seeing a million-year story stitched into cotton and wool, into silk and synthetics, into everything we wear, from ceremonial robes to the softest sleepwear. We are not just wearing clothes, we are wearing time, and so perhaps tonight, before you slip into something comfortable, or peel off the day's armour, you might pause. You might run your fingers across your skin, your real skin, and remember that it was once enough, that it once faced the sun, the wind, the thorn, the teeth, and it endured. And in that memory you might find something unexpected, a softness, a resilience, a strange quiet pride, for though we have covered the body remains, and beneath every woven thread, beneath every cultural expectation and symbolic weight, there is still the same ancient creature who once walked naked across the savannah, not lost, not ashamed, just unfinished, still becoming. It began with the sun, not the warm afternoon sun we know today, but a relentless ancestral presence, a cosmic furnace that poured ultraviolet fire onto naked skin. When we shed our fur, we did not simply step into exposure, we stepped into a covenant. From that moment forward, light would write its signature across our bodies, not just in burns or tans, but in the very molecules of survival. The bare human form, stripped of its pelt, became a canvas upon which geography would paint its will. But what happens when a naked body built for the equator begins to wander? Around 200,000 years ago, our ancestors, dark-skinned, lean and sunborn, began to spread. Not all at once, and not with certainty, but with a slow, persistent curiosity. They moved through the Sinai and Levant, across Central Asia, down into the islands of the Pacific, and eventually into the snow-wrapped corners of Europe and beyond. Each migration was not merely a relocation, it was an experiment, a biological wager against the elements. And the most unforgiving of those elements was light. At the heart of this wager was a molecule, melanin, a pigment so often reduced to discussions of appearance or identity, yet it is first and foremost a biochemical shield. Melanin is a molecular umbrella, absorbing ultraviolet radiation before it can shred the delicate strands of DNA or destroy folate, a vitamin critical to fertility, fetal development, and neurological health. In the fierce sunlight of the equator, Melanin was not optional. It was a prerequisite for thriving. To carry too little was to risk infertility, deformity, or death. But the sun is not the same everywhere. The higher one climbs in latitude, the more the angle of sunlight shifts, scattering UV rays through thicker layers of atmosphere. In the icy lands of northern Europe, the cold was a killer, but so too was the absence of light. And here, melanin's protective gift became a potential curse. For all its power to block UV damage, melanin also blocked the production of vitamin D, a compound synthesized in the skin under ultraviolet rays, essential for bone health and immune function. Without it, rickets could twist the skeleton, immune systems could falter, and reproductive fitness would decline. In these dim places, the body had to make a different gamble, so it lightened. Over generations, skin shed some of its melanin, gradually becoming more translucent to the sun's faint glow, not as a matter of choice, but as adaptation, a desperate negotiation between protection and permeability, a calculated vulnerability. How do you design a body to survive both desert fire and Arctic twilight? There is no single answer, only gradients, only variation, only the slow, beautiful unfolding of diversity across space and time. Skin did not simply change colour, it evolved as a map, a living record of where a lineage had walked, what it had faced, and how it had survived the sun's demand for balance. At the centre of that map lies melanin, not just a pigment but a protector forged through millions of years of pressure and precision. It sits in the skin like quiet armour, produced by specialised cells called melanocytes, nestled in the basal layer of the epidermis. When ultraviolet rays pierce through the atmosphere and reach the skin, melanocytes respond by producing melanin granules, which migrate upward, clustering around the nuclei of skin cells like umbrellas over the genome. These clusters act as shields, absorbing and dissipating harmful radiation. But melanin's role does not stop at defense. It ensures fertility by protecting folate, a delicate, light-sensitive B vitamin floating in the bloodstream. Folate is essential to early pregnancy, a silent architect behind neural tube development in embryos. Without it, birth defects rise, miscarriages increase, populations suffer. And so, in regions where the sun never relents, where UV rays beat down for hundreds of days each year, dark skin, rich in eumelanin, is not merely an adaptation. It is a requirement for reproductive success. It is the body's oath to the future. This is why, in our species' cradle in sub-Saharan Africa, deeply pigmented skin emerged and endured. It was the logical solution to a solar environment that demanded both survival and continuity. Yet even within Africa, there was variation. Rainforests cast their shadows. Highlands invited cooler air. Coastal regions reflected light in unpredictable patterns, and the skin adapted accordingly, not in rigid categories, but in fluid responses to the light and landscape. But when our ancestors moved out of Africa, across deserts, into forests, onto windswept plains, the relationship between skin and sun began to shift. In regions where UV radiation weakened, the once vital armour of dark melanin became a barrier. Less UV meant less vitamin D production, which also plays a quiet, vital role in fertility, particularly in calcium regulation during pregnancy and lactation. The body, ever in negotiation with its environment, recalibrated. The skin grew lighter not to become better, but to survive under dimmer skies. This delicate balance between melanin and sun exposure created a geographic gradient of skin tones, a cline. Near the equator, dark, eumelanin-rich skin shielding against UV damage. At mid-latitudes, intermediate tones, balancing protection with permeability. Near the poles, lighter skin, tuned to absorb what little UV light remained. But these adaptations were not merely about light. They were about lineage, survival, fertility, the quiet calculus of evolution. Colour, in this sense, was never cosmetic. It was ecological. It was ancestral memory embedded in tissue, a biological response to the most ancient of elements, light. And in that dance between sun and pigment, nature wrote a story not of difference, but of adaptation, of resilience, of the ways our species learned to thrive under every sky, as our ancestors pressed farther into unfamiliar climates, into the shadows of mountain ranges, along glacial coastlines, and through forests where the canopy filtered the heavens. skin continued its silent negotiations. In these latitudes where winter could stretch for half the year and the sun barely broke the horizon, the pressures changed again. Sunlight no longer punished but retreated, and in its absence, the rules of biology bent. In such places, retaining enough vitamin D became a daily gamble. Bones, especially in growing children, required it to absorb calcium. Without it, the risk of rickets rose, a disease that bowed legs and deformed the pelvis. For hunter-gatherers who moved constantly and whose women bore children young, this wasn't just a health issue, it was an evolutionary emergency. A misshapen pelvis could mean death in childbirth. A slowed, limping gait could mean being left behind. Once again, the skin adapted. Lighter skin tones, with reduced melanin content, allowed more UVB radiation to penetrate and catalyze the synthesis of vitamin D. But adaptation to dim sunlight wasn't just about pigmentation. It was also about diet. Coastal peoples, for example, often obtained vitamin D through fish and marine mammals. Their skin could remain slightly darker, buffered by nutrients pulled from the sea. Inland populations, however, had to rely more directly on sunlight, and so lightened further. Culture and biology intertwined. Who hunted where, what they ate, and how they lived left fingerprints on their skin. We see the evidence of these gradients etched across the globe today, not in distinct categories, but in smooth transitions. From the deep earth tones of the Nilotic peoples of East Africa, to the lighter browns of Central Asia, to the pale hues of the northern steppes, skin has always been a record of movement, diet, and compromise. But perhaps the most astonishing thing about this adaptive palette is how quickly it occurred. Genetic studies suggest that light skin in European and East Asian populations evolved independently, a textbook case of convergent evolution. In both regions, youth populations face similar pressures: low UV environments, changing diets, seasonal food scarcities, and in both, the same result emerged: a gradual lightening of skin. But the genes involved were different. There is no single light skin gene. Instead, there are many, each tweaking the system slightly, shaping how much melanin is produced, how it's distributed, and how cells respond to light. This means that much of what we consider visible racial difference, especially in pigmentation, is relatively recent in evolutionary terms. Tens of thousands of years, a blink compared to the millions it took to lose our fur. And it means that the colours we wear today are less about ancestry than about environment, not identity. But adaptation, a collective memory of sun and shadow, migration and mutation, carried in the body and past, without language across generations, and yet this living memory has often been misunderstood. In recent centuries, as civilizations expanded and borders hardened, skin, this adaptive, responsive organ, became mistaken for essence, a signal of difference, used not to understand where people came from, but to draw artificial lines between them. The very thing shaped by migration came to justify divisions that sought to prevent it. But nature tells a quieter, more intricate story. The melanin in your skin does not care about borders, nations, or ideology. It only responds to photons. It only measures light. It doesn't know what continent it stands on. It knows only what wavelengths strike the dermis and how to respond to them. And the human species, born in the heat of the tropics, adapted itself with stunning speed and nuance to the uneven geometry of Earth's sunlit sphere. Inuit populations, for instance, live at high latitudes where sunlight is scarce, yet they traditionally retain relatively darker skin compared to nearby populations. Why? Because their diets, rich in vitamin D from fish and sea mammals, reduce the need to synthesize the vitamin through sunlight. Their skin reflects not just the latitude they occupy, but the strategies they've developed to live there. Similarly, some peoples of the Andes or the Tibetan Plateau experience high UV exposure due to altitude, despite being far from the equator. Their skin has evolved in complex response to a blend of altitude, cloud cover, and cultural adaptation. This patchwork of pigmentation patterns, this global mural, is a direct outcome of living without fur. For when the fur vanished, the skin was no longer a private canvas, hidden from the sun and from others. It became the place where light left its trace, a climate diary written in molecules, and still, it is not fixed. Skin colour continues to shift in populations that migrate, in diasporas that settle beneath unfamiliar skies. in children born to parents whose evolutionary paths trace opposite hemispheres. These changes don't take millions of years. Sometimes just a handful of generations begin to write new adaptations, not always visible, but always present in the cellular machinery. A new set of calculations begin, new negotiations with light, diet, and exposure. In this way, your skin is a process, not a product. It is an interface, a dynamic, evolving record of where your ancestors walked, what they ate, and how they survived the sky. Not a wall, but a window. Not a definition, but a dialogue, one between biology and place, one that is still unfolding every time a child is born beneath a different sun than their parents once knew. In this way, your skin is not just an inheritance, it is a negotiation between your genes and your geography, between history and heat. It holds within it a record not of who you are, but of what your ancestors had to solve in order for you to exist. The loss of fur, that ancient turning point, exposed our ancestors not only to the sun, but to evolution's ongoing questions. How much light is too much? How little is not enough? What does it take, chemically, to thrive in a rainforest, on a glacier? In a desert basin where the sun cracks the earth like pottery, and our skin responded, not all at once and not in isolation, but through tiny genetic tweaks, accumulating over generations. A slow composition written in layers, a base of melanin density, the overtones of blood flow, the undertones of keratin and collagen. The colour we see is only the visible result of a far more complex conversation taking place beneath the surface, one shaped by UV exposure, by diet, by altitude, by lifestyle, one shaped by the choices our ancestors made, where to settle, what to eat, how to live. So when you look at your arm in the sunlight, or your face in a mirror, what you're seeing is not just skin. You're seeing a climate adaptation, as finely tuned as a snowshoe hare's coat or a desert lizard's scales. You're seeing the story of your lineage's path through time and place, written in light, and this, perhaps, is one of the most profound legacies of our lost fur, that it did not vanish and leave us blank. It made us visible. It made our bodies legible, to the environment, to one another. Without fur, we carry our biology on the outside. We broadcast where we came from, whether we mean to or not. But we also become storytellers, because now, with our skin bared to the world, we don't just reflect biology. We layer it with meaning, we paint it, tattoo it, cover it, reveal it. We use it as language, cultural, personal, symbolic. We use it to mark identity, not just adaptation. Still, beneath the symbols, the codes, the shifting fashions of culture, the deeper story remains. A biological truth that unites us across time and across tone. Every shade of human skin, from the deepest mahogany to the lightest ivory, began as a conversation with the sun. And every one of us carries its mark, not as a label, but as a living record of survival, written skin deep and thousands of years wide. When we lost our fur, we gained the ability to see ourselves, not in mirrors, not in water's reflection, but in the faces of others. The bare human body, once only a mechanism for survival, became an instrument of emotion, a living screen on which joy, pain, fear, and affection played their luminous dance. Every blush, every shiver, every pallor of sickness became visible, readable, and deeply human. In this new world of exposed skin, recognition was born. And with recognition came something that would forever alter the course of our kind: empathy. To understand another's suffering, one must first be able to see it. Among the furred primates, emotion is often concealed beneath a protective layer. Anger seen through movement, fear through sound, but never fully through face. For our ancestors, the stripping away of that layer transformed skin into a language. The flush of blood beneath the cheeks, the sheen of sweat across the brow, the paling that comes with loss or illness. All these became messages, and with every message received, a new bond was formed. The body was no longer mute. This capacity to read one another's bodies changed everything. It rewired the brain. It encouraged cooperation, fostered compassion, and made deception, once invisible, detectable. A nervous glance, a trembling lip, the widening of eyes. These microsignals became evolutionary gold. The most socially attuned could anticipate others' intentions, soothe their anxieties, build trust and survive through belonging. To see another's skin was to glimpse their interior world, and in turn to reflect it. But this visibility was also vulnerability. To show emotion is to surrender control. Naked skin could betray what words could not. Anger, lust, fear, shame, all broadcast in the play of capillaries and the pulse of blood. Yet it was this exposure that knit our ancestors into tribes, then families, then societies. In a dangerous world, knowing that another could read your pain and respond to it became a matter of life and death. The skin became both signal and story. It glowed in laughter, tightened in grief, and flushed in love. It spoke without language, allowing early humans to communicate long before words had form. Perhaps that was empathy's first voice, not spoken, but seen. And so, beneath the African sun, as bodies moved together, hunted together, rested together, something new was forming in the spaces between them, a kind of mutual seeing, an awareness that I and you were not entirely separate, that one's warmth, one's wounds could be shared. In that gaze, skin to skin, eye to eye, humanity first recognized itself not as a collection of individuals, but as a network of feeling. The mirror of the other had been lit, and in that fragile flickering light, something remarkable stirred, the instinct to comfort, not just to recognize pain, but to answer it, with touch, with presence, with care, compassion. Once a scattered ember in the behavioral patterns of other primates, caught flame in the exposed skin of early humans. The visibility of distress invited response. A limp noticed became a reason to slow the group's pace. A fevered brow prompted the sharing of water. A crying infant with no fur to cling to sparked arms to carry it. And with each small act of care, social bonds deepened. Compassion became not just a moral act, but a survival strategy. Those who tended to the sick were more likely to be tended to in turn. Communities that fostered empathy endured crises, drought, injury, conflict, more resiliently than those that did not. What had once been individual flesh became shared responsibility. The skin became a canvas not only of sensation, but of obligation. Even the signs of aging, which fur might have concealed, became visible. Greying hair, wrinkles, thinning skin, these revealed time's touch. And with that visibility came a recognition of wisdom, of survival, of experience. The elders among early human groups, no longer hidden behind uniform coats, could be identified, revered, and cared for. Longevity became legible. It's easy to forget in our modern world of clothing and cosmetics just how much bare skin once told us. When to approach, when to retreat. Who was well, who was dying, who had been crying, and who was about to. Our ancestors didn't need words to understand each other. They needed only to look, and in looking they became tethered. This new sensitivity, this neural wiring for empathy, reshaped not just emotion, but cognition. Mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when we act and when we observe others acting, found fertile ground in a species that could so clearly see each other's movements, expressions, and emotional states. We began to feel each other's wounds as if they were our own. We began to anticipate needs, preempt suffering, and celebrate joy collectively. Out of skin came society. Out of vulnerability came virtue. And gradually, the care we gave each other took form. Simple gestures became rituals. Grooming became affection. Feeding the sick became duty. Burial became memory. Perhaps this is the true genius of hairlessness. Not merely a thermoregulatory trick, but a foundation for morality, for community, for the soft architecture of love. In exposing our skin, evolution exposed something deeper, a capacity to be moved by another's suffering, and to answer it not with indifference but with action. Compassion was not born in the mind, it was born in the skin. And once the skin became a surface of meaning, of health, of feeling, of trust, it was only a matter of time before it became something more, a surface for art. Because to be aware of another's pain is also to be aware of one's own self. The mirror of the other reflects us back to ourselves, and so somewhere in our long ancestral past the body became more than function. It became message. It became memory. It became myth. The first decorations were likely gestures. Ash smudged across the cheeks, ochre painted on the thighs, beads tied into hair. We don't know what these early markings meant. Were they signs of mourning, of victory, of coming of age? But what we do know is that they were deliberate, applied, performed. In the archaeological record, red ochre is among the oldest pigments associated with Homo sapiens. Some pieces date back over 100,000 years. Scraped, powdered, and applied to the skin, it was more than colour. It was ritual, a shared language before written words, carried in the curves and planes of human bodies. And unlike fur, skin receives pigment. It stains, it absorbs, it holds. This ability to transform ourselves visually, to become more than just what we are biologically, was revolutionary. It allowed early humans to perform identity, to embody belonging. Clan patterns, hunting marks, ceremonial colours. Through these adornments, skin became not just seen, but read. And from this came stories. When you mark a body with colour or scars, or jewellery, you tell the world something. And you also remind yourself of it. Perhaps it is courage, or lineage, or loss. And so even before the first cave walls were painted, the human body was already a canvas of culture. Nakedness made this possible. Without fur, there was no barrier between thought and body. What you believed could be worn. And perhaps in this act of wearing belief, we began to realise something else. That we were not just observers of nature, but interpreters of it. The skin, once merely protective tissue, had become narrative. Each mark, a word. Each gesture, a sentence. Even today we carry this inheritance. Tattoos, makeup, clothing. All are echoes of those first pigments and patterns. We continue to tell stories with our bodies, because that instinct runs deeper than fashion. It is prehistoric. It is primal. It is born from a time when the body was the only canvas we had, and it was enough. This was the quiet birth of symbolic consciousness, not in stone, not in speech, but in flesh. When humans began to adorn, to scarify, to tattoo and paint, they were doing more than decorating. They were initiating the body into time. They were transforming a passing moment into a mark that endured. These marks could speak across generations. A particular spiral etched into skin might signal kinship to those who bore it decades later. A red streak might mean fertility. A circle might mean death, or the sun, or the endless return of both. We often imagine early humans as mute or primitive, but this was not a silent species fumbling in the dark. This was a species writing on the surface of itself, learning that the body could mean more than hunger, more than work, more than instinct. And here lies something tender. These marks were not always for others. Sometimes they were for the self, to carry grief, to summon courage, to remember. In this way, skin became not only a mirror for others to read, but a journal we could carry. The ache of a loss could be made visible. The triumph of survival could be marked. The self, once invisible, could be rendered in pigment and symbol. This was not vanity. This was presence. Presence in a vast, unknowable world. Presence in a tribe. Presence in a body that would one day fail. And in each of these expressions there was also a reaching towards something larger, perhaps spiritual. Many of the oldest body markings are found in burial contexts. The dead were painted before they were laid to rest. Their skin, even in death, became part of the ritual. Why? Because we had begun to understand that the body was more than a vessel. It was sacred, it was symbolic, it was seen. And perhaps through this visibility, the earliest humans began to feel that they were seen not just by each other, but by the universe itself. The body became a signal, not just to the tribe, but to the cosmos. A cry, a prayer, a presence etched in red ochre. So when we trace the history of symbolism, we do not begin with language carved into stone. We begin here, with naked skin and the marks we made to give meaning to our lives. We began by painting ourselves, because before we told stories about the world, we told stories about who we were within it. And those stories began not in caves or fireside myths, but in the mirror of the other, in the raw, open visibility that came with the loss of fur. Skin exposed us, but it also connected us. In its warmth and wounds, in its flush and pallor, It taught us to feel one another not as abstractions, but as extensions of ourselves. The brilliance of this evolutionary gamble was not merely physiological, it was emotional, spiritual, social. What had begun as an adaptation for heat became a portal to communion, a way of reading and being read, of interpreting signals written in muscle and blood. It allowed us to say, I see you, and just as importantly, I see myself in you. This is not a poetic flourish, it is an anthropological truth. The ability to detect illness or distress through changes in skin appearance, pallor, rash, sweat, likely contributed to early caregiving behaviours. The recognition of emotion in facial expression and body posture gave rise to empathy. The loss of fur, so often seen as a vulnerability, became the basis of our most human capacities. Even today, these patterns endure. We read love in a blush. We sense danger in a paling face. We perceive confidence in posture, anxiety in tremble, warmth in a touch. And beneath it all, the skin remains our canvas of contact. It is what we reach for in fear, what we cradle in grief, what we anoint in birth and death. We live through our skin, and though we have long since clothed ourselves, adorned, concealed, reshaped our appearance, the foundations laid by our naked ancestors still guide our behaviours. Makeup, tattoos, scars, piercings, even the rituals of skincare and grooming. These are not modern vanities. They are ancient languages. They are echoes of a time when skin was the only medium we had to speak the unspeakable. In that age before mirrors, it was each other we reflected in. We looked into the wounds and warmths of others to know our place, our belonging, our fragility. This awareness, born not of dominance but of exposure, is one of humanity's oldest inheritances. The mirror of the other did not just teach us to recognize, it taught us to care, to create, to remember. It turned the body into biography, and so, when we ask why humans are hairless, the answer cannot end with thermoregulation or parasite control. The answer lies deeper in what that hairlessness made possible, a skin that could feel, signal, ache, blush, and be marked with meaning. A skin that could reflect the soul, and that, perhaps, was the most human invention of all. There is a quiet paradox resting in our skin. In becoming naked, we did not merely shed fur. We revealed ourselves to the world, more exposed than any creature before us. Evolution gave us a new armour made not of hair or hide, but of meaning. A skin that listens, a skin that signals, a skin that suffers. And in that vulnerability we gained power. But all power has its cost. How do you guard a fortress whose walls are made of touch and temperature? How do you survive when your body is as open as a scroll, every layer of it susceptible to the searing rays of the sun or the invasive touch of time? The first price we paid for this evolutionary gamble was written not in language but in lesions, in rashes, in burns, in cancers that bloom like cruel flowers under too much light. Melanin, for all its brilliance, could only shield so much. And when our ancestors began to wander far beyond the equator, into lands where clouds lingered and seasons turned, this shield began to thin. What must it have felt like for early migrants crossing into higher latitudes, their dark skin absorbing precious little sunlight, their bodies slowly starving not from lack of food, but from the silent famine of vitamin D deficiency? Bones warped under this invisible scarcity. Infants died before language could even give name to the affliction. And in the genetic drift of these tragedies, skin began to lighten, not for beauty, not for preference, but for survival. Yet light skin came with its own curses, increased sensitivity, greater susceptibility to skin cancers, and the burden of burning in sunlight once protective. The skin then became a battlefield, not only a canvas of culture and expression, but a place where evolutionary compromises left their scars. From eczema to albinism, from vitiligo to sunstroke, our nakedness left us fragile in a world that did not always forgive fragility. And unlike the pangolin or the porcupine, we could not hide beneath armour. Instead, we covered ourselves in knowledge, in ritual, in the medicines of bark and clay and instinct. But some costs cannot be so easily healed. As soon as we could see one another fully, when nothing lay between the eye and the epidermis, the gaze became a force of its own. What began as empathy, the ability to read emotion in flushed cheeks or trembling skin, soon birthed something darker. Shame, judgment, alienation. To be seen is not always to be understood, and when the body is bare, the soul is not far behind. What happens when the price of being visible becomes a weight too heavy to carry? In the story of our species, that moment arrives quietly, not as a single invention or law, but as a change in perception. Once, to be naked was simply to exist. There was no shame in skin because there was no alternative. The body was a tool, a vessel, a presence in the world. But as consciousness deepened, and as we began to see not just function but form, the body turned from being of nature to being apart from it. What was once simple exposure became charged with meaning. The first taboos were likely practical. Nakedness invited cold, insects, injury. Covering oneself had purpose. But somewhere between the practical and the sacred, the body became controversial. It became a site of control. Myths arose to explain this discomfort. Stories of forbidden fruit, of garments of shame, of gods who covered their creation after seeing too much of it. Beneath the surface of every myth is a truth about human psychology. To expose the body is to reveal the self, and that kind of honesty is terrifying. Nakedness, which once signalled belonging to the natural world, became a symbol of exile from it. We began to draw invisible boundaries. What could be seen, what must not. What was clean, what was unclean. And in doing so, we layered our species with a new kind of clothing, social expectation. Across time and cultures, these expectations evolved into intricate codes. The Romans bathed communally, but punished public indecency. The Greeks sculpted naked gods, yet concealed living women. In one age, nudity was divine. In another, it was disgraceful. The meaning of skin oscillated like light through stained glass. Beautiful in one colour, sinful in another. Always visible, always contested. This tension lingers in us still. Even now our nakedness unsettles us. In art, in media, in the mirror. We have built empires of industry around concealing and revealing, regulating and monetizing the same surface evolution once left bare. What began as a pragmatic adaptation, the loss of fur, has become a labyrinth of laws, morals, and myths. But perhaps what lies at the core of all this unease is the same vulnerability that once drove us to cooperate. The same fragility that inspired empathy also invites judgment. The same transparency that made us readable also made us ashamed of being read. We learned to hide not only our bodies but our truths. The skin, once our first language, became a veil, and behind that veil grew the uneasy duality of being human, the need to be seen and the fear of it, the longing for connection and the dread of exposure. Our nakedness, once our nature, had become our negotiation. And in this negotiation, something uniquely human began to emerge: self-consciousness. To be naked is not just to lack clothing or fur, it is to stand in the full light of others' attention, aware not only of their gaze, but of what it might mean. We are the only species that blushes, the only ones who avert our eyes from our own reflections. In the exposed plane of skin, a mirror was formed, not of glass, but of mind. Skin became the site of not just biology, but of identity. Its colour, its texture, its scars and markings, all began to carry meaning beyond the physical. Through this thin membrane, society imposed value, desirability, purity, even worth. The body became not just a place to live in, but a thing to be judged by. Consider the adolescent standing before a mirror in the quiet horror of transformation. Acne blooms across cheeks. Hairs emerge in awkward places. The skin, once unnoticed, now shouts. Every blemish is a declaration. Every mole or mark becomes a referendum. To be a teenager is to enter a new form of nakedness, not of the body alone, but of the self laid bare before judgment, internal and external, and the judgment is relentless. In ancient tribes, in modern cities, in every corner of history, humans have developed rituals not only to care for the skin, but to manage the meanings it holds. Makeup, tattoos, paint, surgery, shaving, covering, revealing. Each act a negotiation with visibility, each gesture a statement about who we are or wish to be. But with each negotiation comes cost. Anxiety blooms where once there was simplicity. The fear of being watched turns to the fear of being unseen. The loop tightens. We hide ourselves to protect our truth. only to find that no one sees who we truly are. We reveal ourselves hoping for connection, only to risk ridicule. The naked body becomes a paradox, both too much and never enough. Even in the most intimate spaces, lovers' beds, hospital rooms, birth and death, the body is fraught. Its bareness invites both tenderness and discomfort. We recoil from our own mortality glimpsed in the flesh of others, even as we reach for them. We crave touch, but struggle with being touched. Our skin, designed to regulate heat, now modulates emotion. The cost of being visible is not just social or cultural, it is existential. To live in a body without fur, without armour, is to move through the world permanently touchable. And in that touchability lies both our deepest gift, the capacity for closeness, and our deepest burden, the ache of never being entirely safe. But perhaps it is in that ache that something greater begins. Vulnerability, though often feared, is not merely weakness. It is also the birthplace of intimacy, creativity and courage. In our hairless skin, in this constant openness, we are offered not just risk, but opportunity. It is because we are exposed that we reach for one another. It is because we are touchable that we crave to be held. From the moment we are born, slick, raw, and crying, we are received not with shields, but with skin. Skin-to-skin contact is among the first sensations we ever know. And it is not incidental. It regulates our heartbeats. It stabilizes our temperatures. It anchors us to existence. Touch is not a luxury. It is a language more ancient than words. So what does it mean that we evolve to be always and inescapably touchable? It means that we evolve not only to survive, but to bond. Nakedness, though dangerous, made possible the delicate choreography of human relationships. It enabled nuance, the shiver of fear, the flush of desire, the tremble of sadness, all signs written across the surface for others to read. We became emotional thermometers for one another, not in spite of our vulnerability, but because of it. Yet this openness also made us fragile in new ways. In a furred body, strength is physical, resistance to cold, camouflage from predators. But in ours, strength is relational. It is about who will cover us when we're exposed, who will recognize the signals on our skin and respond. A baby with no fur cannot survive alone, and neither can the adult it becomes. We build families, tribes, societies, not merely for convenience, but as shelters from our own naked exposure. When those shelters fail, when touch is withheld or shame is amplified, the damage is not just emotional, it is neurological, developmental, even immunological. Studies today show what our ancestors may have felt intuitively. Isolation wounds us. Being unseen, or worse, seen and rejected, leaves marks beneath the skin. Mental illness, body dysmorphia, disconnection from our physical selves. These are not modern problems. They are the echoes of ancient vulnerabilities unanswered. But still, we try, we decorate, we adorn. We perform rituals of healing and beauty, hoping to make peace with the very thing we cannot escape, our exposure. Every act of self-care is a small revolution against shame. Every honest touch a defiance of fear. To walk unguarded in a guarded world is the quietest form of bravery. Perhaps that's what the skin teaches us most. That strength is not the absence of exposure, but the willingness to remain soft in a world that hardens. That the body, this living parchment, carries not just our history but our hope, and as we stand in this light, both seen and seeing, we are reminded, to be naked is not just to be human, it is to be alive. Perhaps this is the great irony of our evolutionary path. What seemed, at first glance, a simple physical adaptation, the loss of fur, became a turning point for the human condition. In shedding that natural armour, we did not simply change how we survived, we changed how we related, how we thought, how we felt. Nakedness was never only about the body, it was always, from the beginning, about the soul. Because to be bare in the world is to be available to it, to be imprinted by it, scarred by it, yes, but also shaped, carved, warmed. The sun touches us more deeply, so does sorrow, so does love. Our skins may burn, may bruise, may tremble, but they also blush and glow and tingle with delight. We feel, and through feeling, we remember that we are here. In this state of constant exposure, humans began to build new tools, not only garments and shelters, but rituals and language, art and ethics. We built stories to explain what we saw on each other's bodies. We made myths to contain our pain. We made music to echo the rhythms of heartbeat and footfall, laughter and weeping. Nakedness birthed not only vulnerability, but culture. It is no wonder that many of our earliest gods wore skin like ours, walked barefoot through creation, bled and bore and wept. In them we saw reflections of our own fragility, not hidden, but made sacred. In stories of creation, skin is clay, dust, breath. And shame, that deep twin of vulnerability, appears in nearly every origin tale, wrapped around the moment we first noticed ourselves. First noticed that we were seen. But even in shame, there is the seed of awareness, of becoming. To feel exposed is to know that you exist, that you matter, that others see you and react, and from that spark, that shiver of mutual recognition, all of civilization slowly unfolded. So yes, the cost of our vulnerability has been great. Disease, discomfort, disconnection, the constant need to mediate and modify how we appear, the endless effort to feel safe in a body that is always open. But this same cost has purchased something immeasurable: tenderness, art, empathy, intimacy, a life not just lived, but shared. And as we prepare to move into the final stretch of this journey, we carry that truth with us, that what made us most vulnerable may also have made us most human. That in the quiet shimmer of bare skin, across time and across continents, the story of our species is still being written, one touch at a time. What does it mean to be born into a body with no fur, no armour, no disguise, just skin? After our long journey through time, this question does not ask for an answer. It demands a reckoning. Human hairlessness, once a scientific oddity, has become a mirror reflecting something deeper, a clue not just to survival, but to meaning. If the history of life on Earth is a symphony of adaptation, then our bare skin is one of its most haunting melodies, a choice, conscious or not, to become vulnerable in exchange for something greater. From the moment our ancestors stepped onto the open savanna, exposed beneath the unrelenting sky, their skin began to tell a new kind of story. No longer hidden beneath a layer of fur, the body was laid bare, not just to the elements, but to the eyes of others. And yet this nakedness was not weakness. It was an invitation to connection, to invention, to transformation. It was not the absence of something, but the beginning of everything else. What do you become when nothing hides you? You become heat and salt and motion. You become scent and gesture and touch. The human skin, porous, flushed with blood, alive with nerves, is no passive wrapper. It is our first language and our last defense. It is the battlefield where sun and shadow negotiate every inch of pigment. It is the parchment on which evolution writes with sweat, scars, and sensation. And through it all, the body listens. The body remembers. The loss of fur was not a subtraction, but a creative act, a remodeling of the interface between self and world. It allowed sweat to flow freely, cooling the engine of a body that would come to run farther than any predator dared. It allowed touch to become nuanced, a whisper of reassurance, a flicker of warning, a child's breath against a parent's chest. It allowed wounds to be seen and healed, emotions to be recognized, bodies to be read like living maps of time and tenderness. And in the quiet miracle of this transformation, something else awakened: awareness. To feel one's own skin is to feel the boundary between self and not self, to know where you end and the world begins. But with that knowing comes a strange reversal, because it is only by being touched that we understand ourselves as real. What happens when the barrier becomes a bridge? What other species in the vast lexicon of life chose exposure over concealment? What other animal made its greatest tool out of fragility? None, perhaps. And yet here we are, clothed not in fur, but in memory, in culture, in symbols, in ritual. We have wrapped ourselves in stories. And all those stories began with skin, not because it covered us, but because it revealed us. So what does it mean to be human, in this skin we're in? Is it a compromise with nature, or a declaration to it? Is it a compromise with nature, or a declaration to it. That in shedding our fur, we did not choose protection, but participation. To walk the earth not as armoured creatures, but as permeable beings, able to feel the sun's warmth and the sting of cold, to blister and bruise, to blush, to glow. We chose to be seen, and being seen, we became something new. Not just surviving organisms, but storytellers, because every patch of our skin is a conversation, with the sun above, the climate around, the people beside us. As humans spread out from Africa, their naked skin became a site of extraordinary evolution. In lands where the sun lingered and scorched, the skin darkened, rich in melanin, not just pigment but protection. It guarded folate, essential for fetal development. It turned the skin into a living shield. In places where clouds gathered and winters stretched long, the skin paled, a strategic trade, letting in ultraviolet rays to synthesize vitamin D when sunlight was scarce. These were not aesthetic shifts, but deeply functional adaptations. The canvas of our skin recorded the long negotiation between light and life. Over generations, it told the story of where we had been and what the land demanded of our bodies. We didn't carry a single pattern. We carried the memory of many places, and in each place, skin recalibrated its chemistry, its hue, its breathability. It became a barometer of the local earth. But even as evolution wrote upon us, something else began to stir. Culture. Unlike fur, which is fixed, skin is mutable. It can be decorated, painted, pierced. It can be written upon, ritualized. Our ancestors may have started with ochre, the iron-rich pigment used to colour skin and stone alike. It wasn't about vanity. It was about belonging, identity, ceremony, signal. The human body, once left uncovered by fur, became a cultural canvas, one that could show allegiance, grief, celebration. A body marked in scar or ash or paint said, "I have endured. I belong. I remember." In this sense, our hairlessness was not just evolutionary, it was expressive. The absence of fur made presence visible, but visibility is never neutral. To be visible is to be vulnerable, to admiration, to shame, to danger. A wounded animal can hide its injury beneath fur, a human cannot. We became transparent in our pain, and perhaps strangely, that transparency seeded the growth of compassion. When you can see another's suffering, see it on the surface, it's harder to ignore. Perhaps that is what nudged us millennia ago toward tending the sick, toward burial, toward empathy. We could see each other's humanness and feel it as our own. Our skin became the first mirror, and in this mirror we glimpsed not only the other, but the self, reflected through shared experience. That may be the quiet revolution that hairlessness gave us. Not just temperature control, not just endurance, but awareness of others as sentient, suffering beings. This new consciousness, a bodily empathy, was not abstract. It was immediate. When you could see the fear in someone's face, the flush of embarrassment, the pallor of sickness, or the joy that radiated through a smiling expression, you responded. You adjusted. Skin became a signal not just of health, but of humanity. And in this mirror, bare and reactive, society evolved, not just biologically, but socially, emotionally, symbolically. Because skin did not just protect us, it connected us. It became both boundary and bridge. On the one hand, it defined where we ended and the world began, a flexible, porous envelope that shielded internal organs while constantly exchanging heat, chemicals, sensations. But on the other hand, skin was also the first surface we used to touch and be touched, a site of intimacy, a medium of bonding, a silent communicator of presence, intention, affection. In infancy, skin-to-skin contact is vital. It regulates heartbeat, temperature, hormone release, but the need doesn't vanish with age. Lovers touch, friends embrace, elders stroke a child's hair. These gestures are not sentimental fluff, they are neurological nutrition. They lower cortisol, raise oxytocin. They are ancient rituals of trust, of belonging, and they only work because our skin feels, because we are exposed. In many ways, being hairless made us profoundly terrestrial. Think of a primate covered in fur, heat, emotion, and even minor abrasions are hidden. But for us, the skin is a canvas of clues. It sweats with effort, flushes with anger, goosebumps in fear or awe. It's reactive, responsive, and readable. To live in human skin is to live in perpetual exposure to elements, to attention, to empathy. It is also to live in difference. No two people's skin is exactly alike. Our tones, our textures, our sensitivities vary not just by geography, but by ancestry, by age, by experience. Some of us scar easily, others tan deeply, some react to the lightest irritants, others seem built for the sun. Skin diversity is ancient. It is the record of adaptation written in real time. But for all its variability, skin also unites. We all shed it, feel through it, are hurt by it, healed by it. It is the body's most democratic organ, always there, always working, always telling the story of what we've survived. And survival, in a deep time sense, is what this story has been about. To lose fur was not to grow weak. It was to open the body to an entirely new way of being, more in touch, more alert, more expressive. The skin was not a downgrade from fur, it was a transformation, a shift from the insulated to the intuitive, from the protected to the perceptive, and from the beast to something else entirely. Because the story of our skin is not just about biology, it's also about meaning. Once the body became visible, once our canvas was laid bare, we began to write upon it, literally and figuratively. We painted it with ochre tens of thousands of years ago. We adorned it with beads and scars, tattoos and pigments, before we ever etched symbols on cave walls. The earliest art, in some ways, was not on stone, but on skin. This act, to mark the body, is uniquely human, not just because of our hairlessness, but because of what that exposure made possible, a symbolic self. To decorate the skin is to say, I am aware that others see me. I respond to that gaze. In that sense, skin became the birthplace of identity. Not simply individual identity, but shared belonging. Clan markings, ceremonial paints, coming-of-age scars. These were not about vanity, they were social declarations. Skin became a language, and humans became authors of themselves. Even today the urge endures. Makeup, clothing, jewellery, body modification. All these trace back to the same origin. A body that is exposed, and a mind that understands that exposure matters. And yet, even as skin has become a surface for art and expression, it remains deeply vulnerable. That's the paradox. This organ we use for touch, for signal, for bonding, is also the organ most easily burned, bruised, or broken. We protect it now with sunscreens and textiles, but still, its sensitivity defines us. And its openness is part of why we remain psychologically porous, affected by the gaze of others. We are creatures shaped by how we're seen. That fact echoes across culture, in rituals of shame and pride, in the joy of being admired and the anguish of being judged, in the small act of covering a blemish, in the deeper act of covering a body. We use skin to signal strength, but often to hide our perceived weaknesses. Still, the lesson of human skin is not that we must armour it, but that we must learn to live within its gift. Awareness of self, of others, of the world. Bare skin has made us feel, and through that feeling we've built worlds, emotional, social, symbolic. We've clothed ourselves in meaning because we began naked, and we've connected to each other because we were once too exposed to survive alone. So in this final stretch of our journey, we don't just ask how we lost our fur, but what we gained in return. And it seems, somehow, we gained everything. For in the end, to lose our fur was not to become less animal, but more human, more dependent on one another, more expressive, more inventive, more attuned to pain and to beauty. The skin we inhabit is not a uniform. It changes, with sun, with age, with time. It wrinkles, it scars, it blushes, it heals. It records our history, personal and evolutionary, like a palimpsest of touch and trial. And in that record lies a subtle truth. Evolution did not simply shape us for survival, it shaped us for meaning. Skin became a canvas not just for physical sensation, but for storytelling. When we hold a newborn against our chest, skin to skin, Something ancient stirs, something beyond language. It is not knowledge, it is knowing. A continuity stretching backward through millions of years to ancestors who first discovered that warmth and contact could mean safety and recognition and love. When we run our fingers across someone else's arm, when we feel the heat of another body, when we close our eyes and let sunlight fall across our face, we are not merely sensing, we are remembering. Because this naked skin is not a flaw to correct or a shame to hide. It is a threshold, a place where the self meets the world, again and again. It has made us vulnerable, yes, but it has also made us human in ways no fur ever could. And as we've wandered, from savanna to tundra, from forest to desert, we've taken this vulnerability with us. We've protected it with tools and rituals. We've adorned it with culture and imagination. We've mourned its fragility and celebrated its strength. We've looked into mirrors and into each other's faces, and we've seen not just survival, but significance. So perhaps that is where this journey leaves us. Not at an answer, but at a deepened gaze, to see the skin we're in not as a problem to solve or a curiosity to explain, but as a gift to notice. A surface always in contact with the air of the present and the deep time behind us. Human skin is not the end of our story. It is the place where the story continues, breath by breath, glance by glance, touch by touch. We are hairless, we are radiant, we are exposed, unfinished, unfolding. And in that unfolding is wonder. Always wonder. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road across the bare terrain of our origin, through sweat and shadow, across deserts of silence, into the astonishing story of the skin we live in. If this story helped you feel a new closeness to your own body, sparked wonder at the quiet brilliance of our biology, or simply offered a moment of stillness amid the noise, thank you for letting it find you here. I wonder what part of this story will remain with you. Was it a moment of surprise, or something that felt familiar in a way you couldn't quite name? Whether it was the vision of humans shimmering with salt in the sun, the hush of footprints tracking through dust, or the shared warmth of skin meeting skin in the dark, these are the echoes that braid us together across time and screen. If one of those moments stirred something in you, you're invited to leave it in the comments, a quiet offering, a thread in the wider tapestry we're weaving here. If you'd like to keep puzzling through stories like this, you can like, share, or subscribe. There's more to come waiting just beyond the next ridge of history. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful,